not sure if we did get the memo. Good morning from Teresa regarding Arizona.
Yes, I
Did you
got
see that
that
one?
in the,
'Cause I don't think it's
it's not in
directly.
there? Okay. Leave. I let
Oh, it
Tony.
is in there.
Okay, Tony's going to read the legal stuff. Morning, everybody. I'm sorry we're a couple minutes late getting started today. Thanks for taking time from your busy schedule. Thanked by two colleagues, Tony Walker to my left, Sarah O'Brien to my right, both members of the board. We've had a number of hearings on this important issue. We've learned a lot and expect to make great improvements and move forward to better service the young people. So with this, I've called the meeting to order, and if I heard a motion to accept the minutes, I'd accept that.
So moved.
We have a second. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Okay. We have two people asked to make public comment, maybe three, huh? Carol Craig, Michael, Fred, right? Is there a Fred that wants to make comment? It's Kiski or, oh, it is Clips? I know that fellow. You needed to? Okay. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Clips. And so we have Carol Craig first and Michael Chisley second. Carol, would you? Yes. Can we add to this after we get started? What are the rules of the road here? I want to do the right thing.
Adam.
Chair discretion. We're going to waive it because this gentleman just wants to speak. Okay, from now on, would you, that's technically the rule, no big deal. Right, and so we have three speakers. Your name, sir? Oh, I know. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for this opportunity to speak. I'm Carol Craig, speaking for the president of the Greater Indianapolis NAACP, Crystal Ratcliffe. I thank each of you for the opportunity and for your dedication to the children of this state. And President Elsner, I certainly appreciate your remarks when you said that you have listened to us and you see opportunities, and I appreciate that very, very much. The Greater Indianapolis NAACP is here supporting the Arlington community and the communities of the other three Indianapolis State Turnaround Schools. We support these communities in terms of listening to their voices and supporting the dramatic need for the best researched educational practices for democratic and equitable schools, thus eliminating the gaps in access and opportunity which are devastating these communities and ultimately our larger community and our state. When we listen specifically to the Arlington community, we hear their concerns about continuous neighborhood disruption, lack of stable leadership, high teacher turnover, lack of information, a lack of community engagement, and the continuation of excessive out-of-school suspensions. When speaking with the Deputy Mayor's Office about the excessive suspensions, as we've mentioned before, the Mayor's Office indicated that they had no authority to demand a change in the policy for that school or any school. I also emailed the State Department of Education, and the attorney wrote me back and indicated that the State Department also had no authority to change any policy at the school, and if there were any concerns about civil rights, they would have to go to the federal level. We are alarmed to know that it appears that the civil rights of these children, who are the most vulnerable children, are not protected on the front end. For the above reasons, we recommend the Arlington proposal we presented at the October 9th meeting of this committee, which would embrace a pre-K through 20 community school, bringing about cohesiveness, supports, and interventions with continuity of the curriculum, programs, and instruction. The school would have full extended day learning and wraparound services to eliminate the severe gaps that hamper the success of urban children. However, included in that proposal, in order to eliminate the damaging mistakes made while currently experimenting with these most vulnerable children, we ask that equitable policies and practices with appropriate accountability and authority for these policies be included in the contracts and performance evaluations of whomever is responsible for the oversight. The two technical education centers here in Indiana have available tools that can be used to develop and measure equitable policies and practices to fulfill this expectation. Thank you for your attention and I appreciate your listening. Thank you.
Michael Chisley. Morning, Michael. Welcome.
Good morning, committee members. My name is Michael Chisley. I'm representing the Indianapolis Alliance of Black School Educators, and also I'm a resident of the Devonton area. I came to address the three recommendations that have been proposed by the Indianapolis Public Schools. As a member of IAPSE and the Devonton, we are not in favor of recommendations A or C. Vacant school bears no fruit. Devonton is too large of a community to have a vacant high school for any period of time. One only has to look at what happened during court-ordered desegregation of those schools that were closed and what happened in those communities. Those communities were devastated by closing schools. Second, the combined Arlington and John Marshall is an accident waiting to happen. You have two long-time rivalry schools, and you're going to have pretty much the same problems that the Muncie community schools face when they combine Southside and Central. Basically, you have two different demographic communities with stability factors. Plan B leading to us, we feel like it needs more substance. All three plans are an attempt to warehouse teenagers in a large building. Better approach that we would propose is that a true community-based school with preschool, pre-K through high school with an adult education component, teaching 21st century and adult education skills. We'd also like to see a school that addresses the high suspension rate and expulsions, such as the 88% suspension rate that is presently going on at Arlington High School right now. Public accountability, oversight with the same data that all other public schools have to adhere to, community services and engagement of the community when making decisions, and a positive school climate that is culturally responsive. I'm really not telling you anything that you don't already know. These basically center around Larry Lazat's 7 effective school principles or the correlates, and we just ask that you, when you make this decision, that you take these things in consideration. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your comment. Ron Gibson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to see you.
Good to see you again.
It's been a while since I've seen you, but we worked many years together on alternative education models, so thank you for that. Thank you for both of you here. I'm Ron Gibson. I'm the president of the Devonton Community Association, which is on the northeast side of Indianapolis, representing about 40,000 residents. And Arlington High School is our only high school in the area there. Also, I'm a former city county councilman for 8 years in Indianapolis. I stand today for all of those who have been suspended and expelled in the last 5 years at Arlington. How and why have we allowed minor infractions to take from the most basic rights every child deserves, leading to scores of young people to drop out and become hopeless? One could argue that this is a violation of their civil rights. See, my neighborhoods are full of young people walking back and forth down the streets with no dreams, no hopes, and primarily among African-American young males. We have suspended them in high record numbers. One could argue that we have let them down. The public education system has let them down. In particular, there's no true accountability when it comes to suspension and expulsions. Now, these excessive patterns didn't start when Tinley took over the school, but they certainly continued under their watch. See, we once had an Arlington High School that had well over 1,000 kids in quality school years ago, but now we're down to a school, barely a couple hundred students. And a teacher approached me the other day at church and said they don't even have adequate staff for special education now. So we really letting our kids down in terms of education. But there are two recommendations that I'd like to propose, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee, that I believe that can help Arlington turn around. One, there needs to be transparent accountability with measurable goals and deliverables. For instance, we're measuring academic results, but let's measure suspensions and expulsions and hold those who are running Arlington accountable for that. Because they're throwing so many of my young people back into my neighborhood with no future, and that leads to crime and a whole host of social issues. And then secondly, we believe that the community opportunity school model would be a great model for Arlington. It helps with pre-K, with a continuum all the way up to post-secondary education. And we believe that would help those who are in the system or currently as part of education, but also help those who've been dropped out. With those two recommendations, Mr. Chairman, we believe that Arlington can reform and be a school where every student knows that their teachers and other adults respect them and care about their future. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you for the public comment and taking the time and showing the interest in this important topic. We are going to have now we've read the material, which, by the way, I want to say something about my colleagues here. We've worked hard on this, appreciate their efforts, but I must say the staff and our consultants that have worked with this was well done, and it was a good read, and I thought synthesis complex issue. So thank you for your work. It's outstanding. So at this time, we're going to comment here.
Yeah, I just want to, before we get going, just say some general words about what we're doing. One thing that's really been good about this process for me is just clarifying in my mind exactly what we mean when we say turnaround. And what are we talking about? And as I've thought about that, I think that going forward, as we vote later today and make a recommendation to the full board, I want to have a clear distinction in my mind and the way I'm thinking about this, divided between turnaround, which I see more as state intervention, and state support. I feel that we have a lot of schools that are in need of state support. Now, that's not necessarily turnaround. And I think that we're going to really need to be clear going forward as we think about how we, being the state board or the Department of Education here in Indiana, can assist focus schools and other schools that are in need of state support without invasive measures that rise to the level of being turnaround. Turnaround to me means that, okay, you've had an opportunity at the school level and at the district level to meet the standards that have been set for the students in that school. However, we have a responsibility as a board to at some point say, you haven't fixed that at a local level. And for years, we had parents complaining up in my area in several districts that schools were allowed to just go on for decades on steady declines. No one did anything. The state basically turned a deaf ear to the parents. We closed our eyes to, as the councilman was just saying, to the future of those kids that are being just tossed out of the system. And I take that very seriously. Quite frankly, that's the only reason I agreed to be on this board at the time, because I felt that there was a commitment by the state to really try to do something for those kids that pretty much we're discarding. And in figuring out sort of where that line is drawn between support and intervention, I've always been on the side of things to think that our responsibility to step in and try to start addressing the matter should occur earlier than it is currently occurs under our state statutory scheme. I think we let schools go too long, quite frankly. So I just want to say just generally, so maybe as Tim does his presentation, he can sort of help me out with how I'm thinking about this, but I pretty much have a framework that I'm sort of looking through at this point as it relates to this. And, you know, I believe that any school that after 4 completed consecutive years, qualifies for the category of focus or priority for 4 consecutive years should be the subject of some type of state intervention. And by that, I think it should take two forms. The one thing I think we learned through this process is the turnaround school operator model that we're currently using in Roosevelt and some other schools is probably not the best model. We have been seeing improvements. I think all the schools in that model currently are better schools today than they were prior to the intervention. But if I really assess it, and I think we'll hear some of that from Tim a little later, it's sort of hard to even compare where they are today with where they were at the time of the intervention. So I think that sort of model goes on a shelf as a sort of last resort. So at the end of this 4 consecutive years of focus and priority categorization, what I feel should happen is that there should be a public meeting, which we are required to do under our state statutes. And at that point, the school district should have to come forward with two prerequisites. All right, the first thing that needs to be discussed is, number one, do you need these seats in your school district? Or is this just excess capacity? And I think there has to be a burden of proof there for the schools to show that, okay, we actually really need these seats. If they cannot show that they need the seats, that school should be closed. If they can show they need the seats, I think you go to the next step where the school district should answer the question, can the facility be economically viable and sustainable going forward? Does the school corporation, is the money there to actually keep the physical plant running at an adequate level for those students? And there should be a burden of proof there. And if they're able to meet that burden of proof, then I think we go to the next step. If not, that school should be closed. If you go to the third step, and at that point, I think from what we're hearing, I think the school corporation should come forward with a proposal put together with an external partner of its choosing to say, this is what our plan is to try to move and change the culture and performance of this institution. And at that point, I think the state board, the external partner, and the school district should collectively work out a scope of work and a plan for that school that allows the school to stay in the corporation, work with someone that they have selected themselves to work with, but under very guided and directed autonomies established by the state board. And hopefully, through a process and a matter of years, that school was able to make a turnaround. Now, if the school district does not come forward with a plan and an external partner, then that leaves us no option but to have some means of coming in as the state board and sort of trying to come up with a plan for not only that school, but that district. So at that point, I believe our engagement and intervention has to be into the district, not specific to any school, at which point we come in and establish a lead partner or other turnaround school operator to work out an overall plan for improving the education in that district. Currently, we have turnaround school operators that are coming to the end of a contract period that haven't gone through whatever new system we're going to create out of this process. So the question remains, what do we do with them? And I just like to say that I feel as though that right now, all of those schools are trending upward in terms of their current administration and operation from where they were at the beginning of the takeover or the intervention. Unfortunately, however, I don't feel that there's been enough time to actually say whether or not this has been effective. And as a result of that, I'm supporting an extension of all of the TSO agreements for a 2-year period to collect more data, to allow the changes that are coming out of this process to go into effect, hopefully, and to get us to a point where we can talk about even how to turn these schools back over to the school corporations. That is not clear. It's not clear in my mind, anyway, how we would even turn them back over in a way that wouldn't be disruptive to the progress that's been made. And I think what should happen is after a 2-year extension of the current contracts, we should go into, assuming that there's continued progress, we should go into a transition period that's probably going to take about 3 years, where we slowly transition these current schools back over to the school corporations incrementally. In the first year, school corporation takes over some of the operation along with the current turnaround school operator. The second year, they take over a little more. And then by the third year of that transition period, the TSO is just sort of there as an external partner. And part of what's going to be required from us with regard to these contract extensions is to renegotiate substantial parts of these TSO agreements. There are a lot of things that just weren't addressed. There were some things that were confused because of the statute that needs to be cleared up, hopefully this next legislative session with regards to the statute and laying out the responsibilities. And hopefully we can get over a 2-year extension a much better and clearer picture of responsibility and accountability for turnaround school operators and have real verifiable, measurable types of objectives to evaluate this process on. So that's generally how I'm seeing what's out before us and the direction we want to go in. And so hopefully, Tim, as you go through your presentation, you could just tell me where I'm off the rails and that type of thing and things I maybe need to look at. But the one clear thing that I've gotten out of this process is that we need to be much more focused on a sort of external partner model whereby whatever capacity and progress that is being built during the state intervention stays in the school or the school district after the termination of the intervention. Thank you.
Just a brief comment, especially with this being our last committee meeting on school turnaround. As someone who served on the board when we first had these initial conversations on what was going to happen in these schools, I think that I speak for all of us in saying that no one thought it was going to be perfect at that time, but that we knew we were going to be making positive choices for growth in these schools for these affected students. I'm thrilled that the board made the decision to step back and evaluate what's working and what's not. I'm really pleased with what I have read in the report that's been prepared for us today, and I'm excited about some of the options coming as a result of that. And I think it's important for us to note today as well that whatever recommendations come from this committee back to our board at this point, that this is not an end game, that we're going to continue listening to the community, we're going to continue learning from what's working across Indiana, across the country, and that we will continue to make tough decisions in order to make every educational experience these students and these communities experience positive. So I think regardless of what comes out today and what direction we take, it will continue to be a conversation, and I'm grateful that the board has decided that is a priority and that that's something we need to continue to evaluate.
Thank you. So we're going to have a presentation, but at the end of the day, there was leadership. This is a situation for years. We let schools and neighborhoods and communities basically, it was expressed, leave young people and families and neighborhoods without any future. And I don't have a lot of time to assign blame. I just see faces of young people with potential, and it's a moral obligation then the state move in. And it's a moral obligation before they fail. And basically we have it outlined in a great strategic plan, and what we have to do is get everybody focused on it. Department, superintendent, educators in the state, where everybody learns. We build up the capacity of our teachers, principals, superintendents, etc., and we engage the community and schools. And if we'll focus on that, we'll have less of these schools that we have to intervene on at any level, because it'll be taken care of. The model of subsidiarity is best. Run the schools closest to the neighborhood. Keep the authority as close to the children as you can. But when it's clear their future's being robbed, there's a moral obligation to step in. We did it. We've improved each situation. Now we want to improve them much more. And so I look forward to the presentation, reading the material. I think you have some excellent points, and so let's begin. Thank you. Tim?
Thank you. So I'm pleased to be here. Thank you, Mr. Walker, Mr. Elsner, Ms. O'Brien. Nice to see you again. So we have a presentation here, and I know you had a chance to review the memo. The presentation is largely, I think, just a synthesis of what you've read. And my intent is to walk you through this. I will take time to pause. We can discuss and ask questions as we go. So I will let you guys guide, but I will certainly make time to pause. So about public impact, I work for education policy management consulting firm. We're based in North Carolina. We do a lot of work, very much a mission-driven organization focusing on improving learning outcomes for students. We do a lot of work in turnarounds with state education agencies, with districts, a lot of expertise that we bring to this work. Our focus for Indiana was to, one, look at promising practices from other states and how they've addressed state intervention, and in October we had a chance to review some of our kind of findings and recommendations from that work. We also looked at performance data for the turnaround academies, and that was also shared, and we focused on the publicly available outcome data for those schools. That was also part of our work. We also interviewed state district leaders. We interviewed the school corporations, interviewed the partner organizations, we interviewed some principals to really inform our understanding and recommendations. Today we'll be focusing really on two things. One, I will kind of share, based on all our work, recommendations for refining the model overall. And there are 8 recommendations we'll highlight. We'll then walk through some of the immediate decisions you have before the state board around what to do with turnaround academies, and we'll have time to really apply those model recommendations to the specific situations you have before you now. So we are focusing both on how to improve the model, and that kind of highlights the scope of our recommendations, but also specifically thinking about the transitions for the existing turnaround academies. What are some options that you should be considering? I'm just going to run through this until we get to the recommendations. So I'm going to jump right in. So we looked at school performance data of the schools. We looked at interviews. We looked at some of the presentations that have been made before this committee by the various stakeholders who are vested in this work. And there are first a few findings that we had, and these are really high-level findings. But one very important point, which I know you're aware of, and I think it's important to emphasize for our deliberations and for the community and the public, is that the turnaround academies, especially the turnaround school operator schools, serve a markedly different student population than they did before student intervention happened, school intervention. For many of the TSO schools, enrollment has been cut in half. We see that the percentage of students qualifying from free or reduced price lunch has jumped from 8 to 21 percentage points across the schools. So I think the point being that this is a very different student population. That's a result of, yes, please.
Well, also I noticed in the charts the students with special needs, et cetera, and number.
I think that was more variable. There were certainly cases of that for some schools. We certainly saw consistently, though, this issue of dropping enrollment and increases in the percentage of free and reduced price lunch.
It did occur to me with the change in the folks you serve, have any improvement at all might be a bigger gain than meets the eye on service.
That's right, and I think in addition to the student enrollment changes, I think it's important not to underestimate the impact of some of the transition challenges that took place. And I think, again, I think you're well aware of some of those, whether they were operational issues around transportation, facilities management, student records. Also, just the drop in enrollment, the impact on the financial conditions of these schools, and the impact it has on planning even for staffing. One of the most critical pieces of a successful school and a successful turnaround is the teachers in the building. And the level, I think, of turmoil, the level of uncertainty around enrollment, all, I think, challenged the staffing model for these schools. Not to make an excuse, but I think it's an important context for considering the performance. The other comment here is that performance has been uneven with modest gains on some indicators. When we look at the major indicators around student academic performance on the state stat tests, on graduation rates, the kind of key, even on some growth measures. We see some pockets of success, but also, some areas where there's even been flat or stagnant growth. But I think it's important to recognize this is based on 2 years of data. And again, given the kind of operational challenges, it does question just how much could have been accomplished during that time.
In those interviews, beyond data, would you say all of them have better culture, environments, in which to educate young people?
I think I think a caveat I would put there is why we were not able to get into the schools. So I think there was I know that Pensaris was a consulting firm came last year and was able to be in the schools and had a number of findings about the culture and climate in the building. I think that data, along with interviews, indicate there has been improvements. I think it's sometimes difficult to interpret things like suspension rates and expulsions. Those are certainly not the outcomes you want for students. You also have cases where when you're trying to establish a new culture in a building, you see increases in some cases, but those should be short-term increases, and you should over time see a reduction in those kinds of measures. But again, I think the context of the changing student population, the context of some of the turmoil that surrounded the interventions, it's certainly, I think our point here is that the data we're looking at that we've shared is important data, although I would view it more as descriptive rather than an evaluation of the effectiveness of the model. And I think to Mr. Walker's comments, we will talk about recommendations around extending contracts, but we want to, we would certainly recommend that moving forward, have a more robust and clear set of performance goals. And the idea being that with a little more stability, now that the schools are in place, you can have more reliable goals to base decisions on. The other piece I'll just emphasize is that there's evidence both from some of the actions of school corporations as well as interviews that the very act of the state taking action to take over the schools has motivated bolder, more dramatic changes for school corporations. I mean, Evansville is an example of this, where they've really taken some pretty significant steps to change how they support low-performing schools. I think also there's a recognition that the state's action is now prompting schools, corporations to more rigorously consider how they're addressing low-performing schools. And then last, there just were a number of, I think, findings that were shared across interviewees that just speak to the need for more clear roles and responsibilities for all parties, the need to make decisions about schools in the broader context of the district. So a whole number of things that some of which we shared last October, where I think a lot of stakeholders had similar views about some of the challenges of the model.
That second point I want to keep before us. System thinking has to be our mantra. You can't look at a school in isolation, not economically, not socially, not culturally, and certainly academic performance. This probably isn't the best, has limitations, but you can't suddenly in high school sprinkle some magic dust on students and get to the grade level. This is a process of 13 years of education. We intervened in schools, but there is a system, and that's recognized by everybody's discussion.
And I think the recommendations we share will certainly address this issue, and I think it's consistent with many of the concerns we heard raised by stakeholders. So we're now going to move over and really focus on the recommendations. And again, we divided this up into two pieces. One is recommendations overall for the model. We'll start with that, and there are 8 recommendations we'll walk through. And then we'll move into specific decisions that the State Board has before it. So here are the 8 recommendations. I'll briefly just walk through the 8, and then we'll discuss each one, and I'll pause between each and open it up for questions and discussion from the committee. So for the 8 recommendations that really we view as priorities, because there are a whole lot of things that I think folks raised and about what can be done differently to strengthen the model, but these feel like kind of the critical 8. One is that there needs to be the state law does do some work to clarify what the options are for moving out of state intervention status, but there needs to be a more clear set of options for the state board and for all stakeholders to be aware of. I think to Mr. Walker's point earlier, also there needs to be a clear pathway. So if a transition is going to happen from TSO to the school corporation or a conversion to a charter, whatever that pathway is, there needs to be clarity about that process.
That's both in and out.
In and out. Secondly, there needs to be more state capacity to manage the process. There was certainly, I think early on, there was an increase in resources, the Department of Education, to support the model. But changes, it hasn't been consistent, it hasn't necessarily been sustained. There is a lot of work required to do this well, and the state really needs to invest the capacity and create a governance and management structure that works.
In Evansville, you were more clear that we need to take over intervention office.
Absolutely, and we'll talk about a couple of different options for what a turnaround unit could look like. But our recommendation is that there is a dedicated unit that is responsible for managing this process and has clear accountability to the state board. The third piece is that there has to be a more meaningful and robust process for engaging local communities in the decisions that are made for these schools. Engaging communities in this work is one of the most important factors to sustaining improvement and coming up with solutions that will ultimately serve students best. So we've got some recommendations about what that could look like, and again, just emphasizing the need for having communities involved in the decisions and the ongoing monitoring of progress.
And that's been part of the challenge, because by the time we've gotten involved with any of these schools, they've been in these conditions of not meeting standards for years. Mm-hmm. So that part of the equation really would happen long before it gets to the point where the state can do anything. So I see that primarily as a district responsibility. So are you, when you're putting it there, are you sort of saying that the onus is on the state board to establish these community-based relationships, or is it the district's responsibility to have these community-based relationships?
I think to your point about, and we're going to, I think a lot of what we'll share here, I think, is in line with what you shared earlier, Mr. Walker. The extent to which the district, school corporation, is really initiating dramatic, bold reforms, in light of, failures for multiple years, engaging communities should be an important part of the work they do. When we talk about school closures, talk about school consolidation, these are things that deeply impact communities. So absolutely that's the responsibility of the district, the school corporation to do. However, when the state is taking the intervention and is taking steps that have been taken, for instance, with the TSOs, the state cannot simply allow that community engagement process to go unmanaged or unsupported. So I think our point here is that to the extent the state is instigating intervention, there has to be effort to engage the community in some way.
I want to make a larger point. The third goal in our strategic plan we just passed as a board is we would show leadership top to bottom. Our strategic plan is for schools. It's not for the state board or the department. It's what we want to do here in Indiana. So it's all those entities. We want to keep schools out of intervention. We're going to have to way to systematically lead our schools and engaging families and communities in those schools. There's no way around this. It was stark when we visited these schools before the intervention of the state. They had been somewhat abandoned by the community and maybe even abandoned, the school two-way street. So if we want to keep schools out of this process, we're going to need leadership at the state level. So what does that look like? How do you measure it? And how do you engender it? As we ratchet up intervention, we're going to have the ability to do this as well.
I'm just going to comment, Dan, I'm not sure how that works, because what you said in passing, I just want to highlight, because in many of these cases, these schools have gotten into these conditions because the school itself has been abandoned by the community.
Mm-hmm. And then they start not really wanting the community to come in and see what's going on, frankly. So it just spiraled downward.
The fourth recommendation speaks to just a lot of the work to date and the work I think that is ahead. It does require partner organizations. It requires talented educators from communities to be a part of the process. And if the state's going to be involved in this kind of intervention, there needs to be a concerted effort to build the bench of organizations with whom to partner, with educators who are prepared to support the turnaround work. Second half here, one is to formalize the transformation zone model. So Evansville Vanderburg School Corporation, has done some interesting work, some work that seems to have some promise, although it's still early, and still we need to see more success from that model. But we feel like that approach, and this I think again speaks to the notion of building district capacity and instigating state intervention that ultimately leads to the improvement of systems that support low-performing schools. But we feel like that's a model that should be formalized as a state intervention. 6 is repurposing the lead partner model. To date, it's been a state-directed intervention, and we'll go into more detail, but the challenge to that is certainly that when you have a partner organization working with a school, within the school corporation policies and hiring procedures and accountability, it's very difficult for a lead partner to have the authority and accountability necessary to make dramatic change. So we think, not that there isn't value in bringing lead partners in to support schools, but we feel like it's probably more of a district-initiated strategy, school corporation strategy, meant to preempt and kind of avoid having a school be at a point where the state needs to intervene.
That's a question on that. I actually really agree with that statement as a whole, with the lead partner being more of a preemptive. My question is, does that come down to a contract wording issue? Do you see that lead partnerships could be more successful if framed differently?
So I think there's two pieces here. So right now the lead partners have all been contracts between state and partner. So I think ideally this would really be actually a school corporation partner contract relationship. At the same time though, I think the state has some role in looking at those relationships, those contracts, and making some determination if that appears to be a relationship, a partnership that is likely to bring the dramatic change that's needed.
So, Jim, if we restated that, join in with you and correct me, but would the state's role be in these early stages, say, look at the way this is going, you're robbing, put it in blunt and dramatic terms, children's future. We've got to see these metrics go forward. Get a partner that'll drive these metrics this direction, or we'll have to intervene.
That's right.
So they make the marriage. We hold them accountable to getting the results up because it's just a moral obligation. We have to have it, but we wouldn't try to manage it. They would have a lot of incentives to commit to that.
It's kind of like what I was alluding to, I think it was at the Gary meeting, where I almost see it as like a two-tier. I don't want to wait until year 6. Like Mr. Walker was saying, I almost see it more as when we hit year 4, if we are at this level consistently, I'd rather see something like a lead partner, something come into play to attempt to fix the problem before it gets to year 6. I don't want to delay the year 6, but I that's why I think I do like this stated as a preemptive solution.
By the way, where's 4 come from? 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 4 weeks? So you better get a partner on this because you can't fix it that next year. How long do you let students set in a building for warehousing?
I think that's one way. I don't think we have a specific recommendation on the year. I mean, one thing to remember is that every state accountability system is different in terms of how it's measuring success. I think there has to be a close examination of capacity and what is the implications if in year 4 you're intervening or year 5. I mean, so I think important to understand what that means. And I think so I don't know if we have a specific, is year 4, year 5 correct? Number 7, and this was certainly very clear from interviews and from feedback, and you've, I think, made this point many times, is that when we enter into these agreements, the role of the state, the role of the school corporation, the role of the partner organization needs to be more clearly defined. And one of the things certainly that I think was challenging to this model has been the state's contracting with partners to support the schools, to run the schools, But there was this requirement, there was a necessity for the school corporations and partners to coordinate, to collaborate on some level. And the state needs to play a stronger role in providing guidance and mediating that process and formalizing that through MOUs and contracts. And the last is to reset performance goals. The initial set of goals for the turnaround academies were inadequate, especially given the change in student populations. And it's really difficult to make transition decisions based on those original performance goals. So to the extent that we're looking ahead and trying to make informed decisions that are really in the best interest of students, we need to reset those goals and create ambitious but realistic and comprehensive metrics to inform transitions. So with that, I was prepared to walk through these 8 in more detail and to pause between each and really let the committee discuss and ask questions. So one, I touched on this a little bit. So again, the current law does not provide enough specificity, I don't believe, to really make transition option decisions. So there is a need to clarify that and to create both the criteria as well as the pathway for these transitions. We think there are really 2 key considerations that should guide transition decisions. One is success at the school level, and this table tries to put this in a kind of a simple framework. But one is, was the school successful? Did it meet the performance goals we set out at the beginning of the contract? We're looking at things like student academic growth, not just grade improvements, but also on individual students. Are they making gains relative to where they were at the beginning of the school year? Operating conditions, not just looking at performance, but also understanding what was student retention like, what was is the school still serving neighborhoods, but a whole range of measures that affect the school level success. And then secondly, did the school corporation, has it demonstrated additional capacity and capability to support low-performing schools? So it's this matrix of how is the school doing and how is the school corporation doing that really should inform what happens, after the 4 or 5 year period of intervention. I think in the ideal world where you see school success and school corporation is also, it is with other schools not in state intervention, it's shown improvement where it's made changes to increase the autonomy and the conditions that help schools be successful. Great opportunity to transition that school back to the school corporation, given that there is adequate collaboration and coordination to ensure that that transition doesn't essentially harm the improvement that's been made. I do think conversion to charter could also be a viable option. I think that's one where you'd want to really understand the school and local communities' views and opinions about a charter conversion. If the school is successful and the school corporation has not been successful, then I think that's a natural chance to look for a conversion to charter. We think a charter is a more stable, long-term governance model than maintaining in perpetuity contracts with the state board.
So at the end game, if you have an operator in there that's running this school or some cluster of schools, and the parents and the community are seeing great success, and one of the things we found when we got into this, the constant churning, they'd plant some seeds, to use an agrarian example, then they'd till it up. Let's get some new seeds in there. And so principal after principal, new program after new program. But essentially, if you have an operator in there and they've won the confidence, they have the performance going in the right direction, and that community says, that school works, leave it alone, then you wouldn't, there's nothing in your recommendation says you, at the end of any contract, you would just say, now let's throw it back in the district. And the community likes the setup and it's producing good results and the young people are flourishing. That is a legitimate option, but you'd have to test and measure the support for it.
Correct, and I think it's important to remember that, I mean, going back to this idea of local control, so, conversion to a charter school can very much be a local control situation.
Sure, the charter could report to the local
Governing,
yeah.
or in a local governing charter board. I think, here's where the state could play some role in ensuring that that charter conversion results in a capable, empowered, locally based governing board for that charter organization.
I go back to our strategic plan. We're calling all schools in Indiana to make it a big priority to engage their the families and parents and the communities very much behind these schools if you're going to be highly successful. Under any condition, that has to be part of it. And that has to be measured. And if it's going well, we'll probably stick with that arrangement. Maybe some change. That'll be key for any school.
So in order to implement this model and to really look at it this way, there certainly has to be stronger performance goals for the schools. There also has to be a mechanism for which we're evaluating school cooperation capacity, which is not currently in place. There are ways, and there's states who have taken approaches to how they're assessing the policies and practices that support low-performing schools, and certainly there are ways to look at how school corporations have performed in improving other schools that are in probationary status.
In those states that do that, evaluate the corporation's capacity, is that in state law?
I think it's less a state law and oftentimes more of state practice, although I think in some cases it's probably about how the state has written its grants to the federal government. For instance, for like SIG grants, there could be something incorporated into that it kind of reflects the need to assess school corporation or school district policies. So anyway, so this is the framework. Again, I think we're looking at this, we throw this out there as a framework for guiding decisions for existing and future turnaround academies. I think on the right side, where you're not seeing school success, then I think going back to the school corporation, or in the case where the school corporation's not demonstrated the capacity, the state really it needs to be thinking about, is there a new provider, is there a different model that needs to be used, or do we need to close or consolidate the school and kind of revisit that decision based on conditions. Questions on?
That conversion to charter school.
Under the HB 13. Yeah. We'll move on. So the second recommendation we spoke to is that there's a lot of work required to do this well for the state. Some of this is kind of short-term, I would say, initial investments into creating systems and processes that work. And some of this is an ongoing investment that maybe is contingent upon the number of schools under state intervention. But what's clear is that the state needs to really both increase the level of resources as well as creating a organizational infrastructure that better supports the work. So our recommendation is that capacity is established through a state-directed turnaround unit. And we'll talk about a couple of different, I think, options for that. One thing is to highlight is that here are the kind of, and it's summarized in the memo, we think about what is the role of the state to do this well. Here are some of the key responsibilities we believe are essential for the intervention process. Some of these things have certainly been a part of what Indiana has done to date. Some of these things I would say would be new, but in all cases it requires a significant investment.
When we were in Evansville, you talked about that was key at the district level, turnaround office, real clear line to the superintendent, which board. That would be true at the state level. A real clear line to this board. We're going to intervene, then we need a unit that can manage what's been established. We don't have that. We had a turnaround office. That spread pretty. Your recommendation, look around the country, is very specific, clear line, authority.
That's right. And the accountability to the state board, the decision-making board, it makes complete sense to have that accountability be clear and direct. So the two options I think we'll discuss later. We're actually going to hold off, I think, in diving deep on this, but the two items that are discussed, we could go deeper, but I think our thinking was to push this towards the end. So there are two options here. One is to develop essentially an independent state turnaround unit reporting to the State Board of Education that really takes on, that is staffed and given clear guidance about its roles and responsibilities that kind of manages this process. The other model, which we've seen some states take, is to create a separate LEA, a statewide takeover district, that would have largely some of the same responsibilities, but just would be organized as a separate LEA. There are some benefits and challenges, perhaps, to both models. We think both are worth considering, and both could serve the needs of the state.
Those could be melded.
They can be melded, and certainly you could create a state turnaround unit and over time determine if conversion to an LEA is the appropriate strategy based on the progression of the model. And the third piece, and I think this came up as well in perhaps Mr. Walker's comments, is that the state does need to have the authority to take over failing school corporations, which is usually as a last resort. This is not something you would enter into lightly. It's not something you would necessarily mandate as a automatic trigger. But where you have school corporations with a high percentage of schools that are subject to takeover, and there's a determination that that simply intervening in individual schools is not sufficient, that there should be a mechanism for the state to intervene at the school corporation level. We don't go too deep into this recommendation, but we feel like this is a critical lever to have fundamental change. You have school corporations with a lot of low-performing schools. Third, community involvement. So we spoke before about this being critical if you want to have sustained and success in these schools. Our recommendation here is that the state take a lead role to ensure that there is a community-based council that has a role in the process. Certainly the state board is going to retain decision authority. The school corporation will have decision authority. Very important to clarify what authority councils have, where they're advisory, where they have decisions. But we think there's a critical role that can be played, creating a process to effectively engage communities through these councils. Their role can largely be about some input on decisions about what the interventions are most appropriate. You heard even this morning about ideas that community members have that would really make schools more effective for the students as well as communities. There's also an important role that councils can have in just the ongoing accountability for these schools. They have a role in looking at how schools are performing, how the intervention's working. And our recommendation here is that the state has some state-level community engagement coordinators or coordinator that works with these communities. This has to be a dedicated function of the unit. Any questions or comments about this?
I'm not sure about what we'd be creating there. I support the idea, but part of me wants to set a clear set of performance standards and tell them, and just be clear, the only way to get there is with parents and families and community engagement. I guess they want us to figure out how to do that. For instance, if you have an operator, you might have a model for community engagement. The district might have one. Now they could ignore it at the children's peril, but I want to be careful how much we can do from the state level on that. I like to support it, but I certainly wouldn't want to think how that's going to happen. Communities are unique.
That used to be, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding was that used to be part of what formerly existed as the turnaround office, and that there were people who kind of led those efforts, and it's not that they over the local community concerns, coordinated, yes. And so I kind of see it as a natural marriage to your previous recommendation, that it's one function.
And I just want to follow up on what Sarah's saying, because I don't want you to think, Tim, that we didn't went into this process without any of this in place.
Sure.
Because
Sure.
we did. We had, when you go back to your key element number one, all of that was accounted for when we began this process. I mean, we had what I thought was really good, and I can really only speak to Gary, but we had great community level engagement in Gary, great partnership building. We have someone in the room that was partially responsible for it. And quite frankly, all of that I felt was in place. All of your key elements from key element chart number one were there at the beginning of the process in Gary. And it continued after the intervention, because Roosevelt set up a local community advisory council, which they still have, which is co-chaired by the mayor. And there's been a lot of community support and engagement, I think, that have led to a lot of the positive outcomes we see culturally and otherwise at that school. And I guess the one other thing that I would sort of take some issue with as it relates to my area is that it largely is the same student population. It's not as big, but demographically it's pretty close to what it was prior to the intervention. So it's not like they're dealing with some kind of cherry-picked group that they're now beginning to make progress with. If anything, it's the opposite, as your data shows, where there's higher free and reduced lunch population, higher special ed population, but yes, the test scores and performance is trending upward.
That's right, and I think this is not to indict that there wasn't any kind of community engagement, but I think more that there needs to be a very intentional approach to how that's done, and doesn't have to be managed off the state level, but that the state can certainly play a role in ensuring that there is a meaningful process in place. Fourth is building a bench. We spoke before about this, that a lot of the reforms here really require on strong, committed partners, expertise and talent to support turnaround work. There are a few different things that could the state could do to build the bench. One thing is that when we talk about having TSOs, for instance, that are able to do this work, there is incredible value and strength in having able to really leverage local talent, local high-performing charter schools, local effective school leaders. So opportunities to really incubate those organizations, and it could be that you're providing resources so that a high-performing charter school has the capacity to expand into a turnaround school. It could be that you're giving opportunities for effective school leaders to have time to plan for and recruit a team that can really support and plan for a turnaround. Making sure that partners have the autonomy to implement their plans, making sure that adequate resources are in place. It is really about creating the conditions that can bring strong partners to the table. And then in terms of the the building of talent, one of the challenges certainly some of these schools had was the TSOs had was attracting and retaining talented teachers. It was made more complicated by, I think, some of the tension that surrounded the takeover. Having to rely largely on TFA and I think alternative certification programs. But the point here is that there has to be some efforts to infuse talent committed to these communities to work in these schools. And there are a variety of ways, actions the state can either directly or indirectly take to increase the talent pool.
Districts, individual schools can't do it all. They'll have to use the word partner up there, universities, programs. You have to have a talent pipeline. Involved in the community engagement, teacher, certainly leadership. Leadership, they live and die on the leadership.
Yeah, school leaders is essential for across, even our cross-sector research on turnarounds, not just in schools. Having a leader with the right competencies who knows how to take the right actions to drive turnaround is essential. That's a high leverage position. There are ways to really prepare talented leaders to take on these roles, and there's more that can be done, certainly at the school corporation level, but also the state has an opportunity to use some of its levers. Transformation zones, so I think some early signs that there are, I think this recommendation is partly based on what's happened at Evansville, Vanderburg, but also, again, it recognizes that there is the need that schools are not failing in isolation, that there are district policies and practices that contribute to that failure, and that by creating an intervention model that looks to build the capacity of districts, you're helping not only those individual schools, but the entire district. Our recommendation here is to really innovate and build off the Evansville-Vanderburg model. That a transformation zone is an initiative where a school corporation sets out a bold plan for changing how it's supporting and staffing and giving autonomy to turn around schools. The state has a critical role in reviewing, revising, approving plans. The state also can set out very clear expectations through an MOU that defines the operating expectations and benchmarks for these transformation zones. And where I think we heard last month some of the positives of the relationship between Evansville and in this case, Mass Insight. I think there's more the state could probably do to formalize that relationship. And we think that can then become a model of how other school corporations can move forward with turnaround work. I think what's also important is we're not saying that it's an essential that a partner is leading this work with a school corporation, although I think it's much more likely to be successful if a school corporation is supported by a knowledgeable and experienced partner organization. It's also possible that this transformation zone can be supported with an external partner that has direct authority for managing those schools. So it's not just an advisory consulting role like Mass Insight has currently, but you can imagine where a school corporation partners with an organization that really does directly lead, run, manage the schools, all under the school corporation's authority, though.
Let's unpack that for a minute. So if the state intervenes with a district, we say you select a partner. The partner needs a span of influence that's codified in a contract. If it's just, at some point there has to, does the lead partner have the ultimate authority and then contract with the district to operate?
I think there probably are really two different ways that a partner can engage with the transformation zone. I do think the current model where you have a partner like Mass Insight working with Evansville-Vanderburg to really advise and perhaps even lead the design of their transformation zone could be a perfectly effective way, given the right autonomy, given the right authority, given the right accountability to make sure that there's progress being made.
Let's just stay with that model a minute. Suppose the progress is not being made. Is this the idea of a continuum of greater influence by the state board?
Yeah, yes, and I think that's where the MOU comes into play. And I think one of our recommendations, even with Evansville, is that the state does clarify and codify what next. What if that is not working? So that's the purpose of the MOU. The MOU is both establishing what are the expectations, but also the accountability for if performance is not hitting expectations.
Because even us following through on Public Law 221, intervening, there is some evidence that other schools took this more serious and started some innovations, interventions to turn schools around. Essentially, if the district with the partner, some kind of assistance, is producing results, then enough. We're going in the right direction. If it doesn't, then you almost have to take a heavier, bigger role and say, what's this look like? And then eventually you have to do some big time intervention in the district. In other words, the environment cannot produce the results. Get back to the moral obligation of the community.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two directions you could go. If you take this approach, so for the Evansville, if over a number of years you're not seeing the progress in those schools, I think there are, the state can go back and say we're going to assign a TSO we want to see direct state takeover. We have talented organizations who can lead that. That could be an option. But another option, I think, is like really requiring a more intensive intervention within the transformation zone, where you do have a partner who then becomes directly responsible for managing those schools. I know there are some provisions, and I think staff can, provide a little more guidance. There are provisions when you have an external organization that is a special management company under public law, then they could have some extraordinary authorities, waiving collective bargaining, just different things they can do to have more dramatic changes in those schools. So I think the point being that the transformation zone could involve a partner organization taking a more direct role, and that could be the next level of intervention.
Thank you.
Sixth recommendation we touched on before is just the repurposing the lead partner model. And I think this is really reflecting the challenge of, we've had, is it five schools now that have had a lead partner, or perhaps four, if you don't count Evansville, 4 schools that have had lead partner relationships. They haven't been able to sustain their relationship or their impact in the schools, have limited authority to really affect change. And our recommendation, again, is to no longer use this as a state intervention model, but really as an opportunity for school corporations to pursue more dramatic change. And this gets into this incentive piece, that let the school corporations take more dramatic action, aided by a partner that can really help drive change, without the state having to dictate what that is. The option, the idea here is that it's allowing school corporations to voluntarily identify partners with whom to work. We think that the experience to date, there is a credible threat of state takeover, and it really does offer an incentive that maybe did not exist 4 years ago, 3 years ago, for school corporations to take more meaningful and bold reform. We do think that the state still has a role to provide technical assistance if desired or if necessary, and also just to set conditions and accountability for those partnerships.
Well, I think I just want to say that the problem wasn't with the model. It was with poor execution on our part, and particularly the way the contracts and MOUs were set up. Had we put more attention into how we set up those agreements and been signatories and had all the parties signatories to the agreements, I think that could have worked well. What do you think?
Well, I think, yes, I think it could have worked better, certainly, if there had been very clear lines of authority. I think the challenge you have is when you've got a school corporation that runs the school, and it has, central office policies that affect the supports that are in the school. If there isn't a great degree of alignment and collaboration between the partner organization and the school corporation, you're going to have confusion, lack of authority. You're not going to have the results you want at the school. So, could the state have played a more direct role in clarifying those? Possibly, but there's a limitation probably to what an MOU can do. If there isn't goodwill and collaboration happening, there's always going to be a challenge, I would argue.
There's 2 types of intervention and support. One where the district and the school and the intervention support, whatever you want to call it, are on the same page working to advance the school. And then there's shotgun marriage, where the state says, you're going to take this partner on, this partner is going to do this and this and this, and the district and the school doesn't want them around. I think what I hear you saying, start off with, say, folks, you need a lead partner there, work out a deal, because you have to have some improvements, or we're going to take the only course we can take, and that's to intervene more deeply in that school and or your district. And hopefully they'll have so much motivation, they'll work out a good deal. We can give them technical assistance and show them model MOUs. And then if that doesn't produce results, then we'd have to take a heavier role, or just leave those children in schools that don't work. And that seems like that's what the point here. That makes sense.
Yeah, and that's why in my business, Dan, we would insist upon a prenuptial agreement because people start out choosing their partners, saying they're going to be together forever, and then that quickly devolves.
Okay.
So I think the prenuptial, in our example, I think even going to the transformation zone, is that, when, a school corporation says, yes, we're going to change things, we're going to do things bold, we're going to do things different, that's great. We love to see the collaboration. But let's also establish some conditions about what success looks like and some measures. So don't leave it to chance. So getting off the marriage analogies, we're going to talk about roles and responsibilities. Who cleans the dishes? Who takes the kids out for the morning walk? So here, I think this is a clear challenge we had, in some cases, not having clear responsibilities for various stakeholders. A lot probably could have been done to smooth the transition for the TSO providers in particular. If there had been a little more clarity and perhaps more state guidance on expectations for the relationship. A whole range of things that should be addressed in MOUs. Again, these are MOUs that could be between the provider and the school corporation. It could be MOUs between the state and the school corporation. But here at the minimum are what MOUs should cover. We hit some of these things last month when we talked about kind of best practices. But even with student enrollment and transition, I mean, there could have been more clarity about how are we going to go about doing student enrollment and recruiting at these new schools. It became kind of a competition in the end, with probably a lopsided competition. And I think if there could have been more clarity about what the expectations were, how feeder patterns may or may not be adjusted based on the TSO model, we could have probably mitigated some of the challenges that were faced. Again, issues of who owns the equipment in the building.
One of the big problems, the day you vote to intervene, get a TSO in place, we have to get a hold of the records. Folks coming in and running the school didn't have information. Somewhere in law, you got to say, vote's taken at that point. Where do you get control of the information? Talk to the students and parents about where they're going to go, what features, conditions are going to be present there, not let it that confusion time cost us a lot of progress.
Community comes into play as well. If communities are informed of what's coming, you alleviate some, not all, of the scenarios.
I think that's where the language really hurt us too, because the whole idea of takeover and, cause a division, whereas folks were suspicious of takeover. I mean, they didn't necessarily feel that it was going to be better to have their kid at a school taken over by the state than with the devil they knew.
The last of the recommendations, again, we're speaking to this model refinement, and we will jump next into specific state board decisions, is just this issue of performance goals. There were performance goals absolutely in the TSO contracts. I think they were not entirely consistent across providers, so I think there's probably a need to make sure there's consistency in the scope of performance goals. There was not necessarily a very explicit link between performance goals and transition decisions, what happens after 4 years. And I think the one challenge that was not necessarily something could have addressed beforehand was just that the dramatic changes in student enrollment and populations really kind of brings those performance goals into question. They're no longer really necessarily very appropriate for making transition decisions. So there's not been any kind of adjustment to those goals, and our recommendation you'll see later is to revisit those performance goals and set clear criteria for the remainder of the contracts. The other piece here, I think, is we mentioned this last month, is that really probably the need to have more robust growth measures for students, especially when you're talking about high schools where you don't have individual growth data year to year, because of the way the state testing works. We would recommend that you do have very clear growth measures that might mean additional testing for these schools, but I think the accountability and the need to really measure truly what are kids learning is really essential. So there are a variety of changes we would recommend, and really the need to have more robust performance goals, Some of that is listed here. Even retention. So when we think about this model, what was the goal of these turnarounds? Was it to ensure that the students being served by those schools are getting a better education? If that's the case, the challenge we have is that some of those schools are no longer the neighborhood schools they once were because of the changes in feeder patterns, because of the changes in enrollment. So, I mean, I would suggest that to the extent that this is really being viewed as a way to improve the neighborhood school, that there are measures that speak to what percentage of students are from the neighborhood, what percentage of students that were there originally stay at the school. So, is it truly becoming a school of choice for the neighborhood? So, measures like that are important for the accountability. And I think, and to the point, I think having measures about student discipline and other climate indicators is also important. And the last piece here, we talked before about our transition decision being based on the two factors of school performance as well as school corporation performance. So there is a need to, and this is even in Public Law 221, is that there is going to be measures of assessing the school corporation district level changes in staffing and structure. So there has to be a mechanism to measure that. That needs to be put in place. So with that, I will pause. Any other questions or comments about these 8?
Have we isolated, I'm not sure if this is a question for board staff, but have we isolated what legislative changes would be required to meet these recommendations? And are we prepared to make decisions based on that? Okay. Sure.
Move on.
There's a few points worth emphasizing again and again, that they're part of systems. We're going to have system thinking. Clarity is across all of these: clarity, performance, roles, responsibilities. And it always comes back to, if you have a group of folks that have worked really hard in a certain set of conditions and structures and cannot turn it around, we're compelled and have a moral obligation to do something different. It isn't about, I guess, less control and the money. But if we can't, under one structure systems, get it done, then what do we do? In each of these. I like there's a progressive model of clarity as well. It seems like you have a continuum role for the state. Very little to
and also a role of really using the state's incentives and consequences to instigate school corporation actions that are in the best interest of students.
I guess one question I have, when you use the term state, are you talking about state board, or in what instances are you talking about State Department of Education? Because that's been part of the confusion, quite frankly, is a lot of things that we're now talking about. When we went into this, we just assumed Tony Bennett's office was taking care of it. And it really wasn't a matter of concern for the state board, because it was set up or structured that a lot of this stuff was going to be done through the Department of Education. It's only later, that the Department of Education stopped doing a lot of this stuff. So now these new recommendations seem to be falling back on the state board. Or to what extent are you saying the Department of Education should resume doing some of the things that you're talking about?
I think there's a great need to think of thinking through how the collaboration works between Department of Education and any kind of state turnaround unit. I think our recommendation is around, if the state board is directly responsible for making decisions about intervention, that there is a compelling reason why the state board, the accountability for implementing those policies should also be under the control of the state board. There needs to be a long-term solution that accounts for the fact that you do have a Department of Education that is working in some of these schools, and has a system of support for low-performing schools. I think what is being contemplated under PL 221 is the notion of state intervention. And that's a kind of a kind of gone to a new, fallen off the cliff, or there's something that's happened that's instigated a more dramatic direct state role. But I think the need to have a well thought out, aligned relationship with the Department of Education and what's happening in those offices to support schools is essential.
Because, I mean, one of the things that I've been hearing is at the school level and district level, I think there's some confusion as to if the Indiana Department of Education has certain obligations and responsibilities related to our ESEA waiver for focus and priority schools, to which they have an agenda and they're doing things. And those are, in many cases, a lot of the same schools we were talking about that would be in turnaround. So there has to be some consistency and I think just efficiency in terms of what's being told to these schools and by who, and do we listen to IDOE with regards to their focus and priority school agenda, or do we follow what SBOE is saying in regards to turnaround agenda?
For this board member, I think when we look at the importance of what the work of education is to individual students and communities, we're going to have to go and look at our structure and how we do governance at the state level. I mean, if you remember the testimony, we had principals stand up here, mayor's office stops by, an outreach coordinator stops by, lead partner stops by, superintendent office sends some folks through. Well, pretty soon the principal's saying, I don't want that much help. I want to know what direction we're going and make it really clear and streamlined. And so really fundamentally at our level, the state board should have the responsibility to bring in school. It's an ultimate kind of responsibility. And the resources and the commitment to schools that are failing children and communities can't be left to chance or any confusion. We have to have the will at the state level to be very clear about that and not have it change. Because one of the things that was how these schools got in, I said this before, I'll say it again, they didn't get in these troubles by accident. And one of the things that was very clear when we went to all those hearings before the takeover, there's too many changes, too many shafts, new program, now we're going to go this way, now we're going to go that way. And we can't let structure and governance laws put these folks in further jeopardy. We have to take care of that at this level. And the state legislature has to help us. Because that has to be crystal clear. You agree to that, right? I thought you outlined it pretty well. And I the other thing is some of this, perfect world, we'd have no politics. But being we live in this world right now, we'll deal with it. Yes, it is unclear. We need to make it clear. And we have to have the courage to do it because people depend on us to do this well. Look at our economic, social, and cultural future. It's tied to families and schools. The school part, we can do this.
Move on to some of the school.
This may be unseen by many people at the base. Thank you.
So we're going to transition. So if those outline the model refinements, ways to make the approach for state intervention to be more successful, we now have some decisions here and now. You have some decisions. So really, we strive to say, let's take those policies and apply them to what you've got before you. I just want to reiterate, there are really three kind of current models that are being used by the state. There is the kind of lead partner model, which we spoke to before. We had really 4 schools work under this. Currently, none of the schools, save for the few that will have the Marzano relationship this year, but there really is not a sustained long-term lead partner model. We're recommending that you eliminate this as a state intervention model, but it currently is in place through this school year. We have the TSO, Turn On School Operator model. There are 4 schools. And, these schools work similar to a charter school in some respects. They are the employer of the staff, and the school corporation provides some limited operational services. And the third is the transformation zone. And this is really what's happening in Evansville, Vanderburgh. This is where you have a lead partner organization working with the school corporation to reform how it's supporting low-performing schools. And again, our recommendation is that this becomes a state intervention model that you consider as you're looking at what to do with existing schools. All right. So several decisions. We'll walk through these. We can take as much time we need to kind of get to a decision, not all the time we need, but we have an hour and a half remaining. The first has to do with the 3 TSO schools operated by Charter Schools USA, and I will invite board staff to also chime in on some of these. We worked with them to devise these recommendations. And the request, as we understand it, is that Charter Schools USA has asked for a 5-year extension of its current contract. Our recommendation is to actually extend this contract by 2 years, setting clear and explicit performance benchmarks for the schools, establish an MOU that between the state and IPS that more clearly defines IPS's role in supporting and engaging with Charter Schools USA in the operation of these schools, but also to establish some benchmarks by which 3 years from now, by June 2018, there are a clear set of performance benchmarks about the school's performance, but also about the district's school corporation's performance that will ultimately decide what the transition is for these schools. A couple of just things to add. Part of the reason why we think a 2-year extension makes sense is that, there has been, some indications of improvement for these schools, but 2 schools continue to receive Fs on the state accountability system, so clearly they have not achieved the level of performance we're looking for, but there have been improvements. A number of transitional challenges, operational challenges, we think have probably really stalled some of the growth that maybe could have been achieved at these schools. So we think adding a couple of more years really provides an opportunity to stabilize the school, to set clear benchmarks, and to have a very accurate and I think robust decision about have these schools improved sufficiently to justify, kind of maintain them as a separate or charter school or something else, or to
Tim, the 2, you're recommending 2 because you want to make sure they continue to improve. You don't want to be locked into a long-term contract. Is that what you're recommending?
Yes, 5 years seems unnecessarily long, in our opinion.
It looks like you're wanting to make a comment.
I just wanted to add as well that the current intervention started in 12-13. So if you took it through June of 2018, that would be 6 full years. In law right now, the board is obligated to make a decision about the exit strategy by December of that last year. So then you would have 5 years of data at that point. Now, the other recommendations that Public Impact has made here regarding having clear goals and performance benchmarks would allow the board the flexibility. Let's say things look really great a year from now. You could make a decision at that time. So there's nothing that says you have to wait that long. You could act before that. The other thing, too, I want to be mindful of, and hearing Tim talk about it, is the level of challenges that these schools have had because of the lack of clarity and the theater pattern system, the transportation issues, et cetera, that have really been a distraction from the academic program. We need the time, as they pointed out, to actually see, is this intervention working? So I think by putting in the performance metrics, you actually get to see a clearer picture of what's happening under the direction of the TSO. It gives the board enough information to decide and assess the capacity of the school corporation, which also has gone through some changes with leadership recently, to decide is the best option to return the schools back to the corporation or spin them out permanently. And making a decision of that magnitude, we think that the board needs more data and time.
I think this might be a wording issue. I think I hear you saying you've got to go a minimum of 2 for continuity and make sure it works. But I wouldn't want to put out the message, this is two and done, because if there's community engagement and if there's progress, I like a minimum of two, but some kind of option to renew under performance and understanding the situation, because frankly, I'm looking for continuity. If it's successful, and frankly, we talked about good partners and committing personnel. You know, if you make big commitments, financial and otherwise, you want the chance to, if it's good for young people and good for that neighborhood, I don't know, sure it's worded correctly, because I think we really want to have we're saying a minimum of two, but under certain conditions, who knows, huh?
Correct.
So we might want to look at how we negotiate that. I think there might be a better way to say it, where everybody's encouraged. We talked a lot about incentives here. If we have a stellar performer and young people are doing well, if I'm still on the board, anyway, I want to ride that horse that's really helping young people and giving them a future. So I just want to see this as a limiter, and I'd like to maybe look at the language of how we're negotiating with these folks, because if they're stellar performance, and we're seeing signs it's moving, I don't want to put the impression out that we're going two and done. Does that make sense?
Looking at the chart for transition options in the school, demonstration of success, and then the preparation capacity, I see the option, if it's a no and a no, remain understand intervention, selecting a new provider. I don't see anything that's continuing with a current. Is that where you see that taking place also? And is that only in the case of no and no, or is that somewhere a different option? In other words, if the school is demonstrating success, the corporation is not, within this chart, we currently have just convert to charter school. Is this somewhere where you would see continuation of a TSO, of an existing TSO contract as well?
We can both comment. I would say one comment here is just that it's an option, certainly. I think there's advantages to just moving forward with the charter conversion, and that I think it signals a longer-term stability.
Okay.
There is right now these schools are kind of like these special, unique things that the state board is having to like actively manage and make decisions. And once it's a charter school, there's an existing governance structure, there's an authorization process, there's a formality to that exists. And really, I think, does encourage the kind of long-term stability and sustainability that I think we all want.
So it could potentially be CSUSA converting it to a charter school under their guidance.
Yes, and as Tim mentioned, we've left for the end of this the conversation with you about the best governance and management structure. But depending on what structure that is, if it were a state takeover district, they can also authorize under existing statute if they're an LEA. LEAs have that authority now. If that's not the board's preference, then there are Indiana authorizers that a board could apply to get a charter and operate it permanently as a charter. And that's kind of the point, is at this time, you don't have enough information to tell you what is the best exit strategy, so you need more time to make the best decision to exit those schools.
District can actually put it back under the district. And it's part of their system, and there's some coordination. The district has leadership movements they're making for staff and that. Very well. I would be pleased, but let me ask how we want to do this. Do we want to finish this? Comment on it?
I might suggest that we do the CSUSA, IPS in its totality, and Arlington, and then ask representatives from CSUSA and IPS to come and speak, if that's your preference.
Dr. Fairby, we're going to finish this part, and then we'll bring you up for comments about if that's okay. Just for process purposes. We're not going to lock you out. So we continue on these.
Yes. So I think there's a few parts to the Charter Schools USA recommendations. The first was about the contract extension. The second has to do with the request that Charter Schools USA has made to expand the Emma Donna Middle School. Currently, it's a 7-8 school, and they're looking to create a K-12 pipeline or feeder pattern school in that building. And actually, I'll let you. Some of this has to do with, I think, what the legal authority is of the state board, as well as what makes just sense given the conditions in the IPS and.
So I will frame the context and then turn it over to John to talk about the legality. But we heard loudly and clearly that the economic model, it's not viable. And then just having a 7-8 only school is very undesirable. So given our council's conclusion that the state doesn't have the legal authority to allow that to become a K-8 school, then the recommendation would be to try to address some of these other concerns, is to place those students within Emmerich Manual. So that could be a 7-12 school, and then the facility is still owned by IPS, so it would have to be returned to the district. So I'll turn it over to John to talk about the legal conclusion about that.
Good morning. There's no clear statutory authority for placing a feeder school in a turnaround academy right now. And part of the problem is that that could be viewed as the creation of a new school, which is ordinarily a power exercise locally. So unless all stakeholders were in agreement as to that plan, you could probably expect some pushback from the local school corporation. So it's not an option I can recommend.
Let me ask about that last bullet. At this time, the State Board of Ed has taken responsibility over Emma Donnan, right?
Yes.
So before we reemploy it as a school, whatever plan, if someone had a plan to reopen it or to leave it set idle, we would, for a year or 2 years or 5 or never or whatever, we would have wanted, the state board would want to retain the authority over approving anything that went into Emma Donnan, right?
Correct.
Right now, we're responsible for it.
Yes.
So you wouldn't just say, well, not create a school there. You'd have to actually approve a plan. If someone's going to put a school in there, IPS or IPS under some other structure, whatever, we'd want to approve whatever plan for a school would go in there.
Well,
and when it would happen.
that's not necessarily true, Dan. I mean, the school is a number. It's the school number. If they choose to close that school, or if we choose to close that school, that doesn't necessarily give us any say over what they do with that facility after that. They can create a whole other school and use that facility.
I wonder.
That is outside of our purview. I mean,
Well,
once that school number is closed out, the building is theirs to use as they see fit, is my
On
understanding.
one level, I agree. On another level, if you think of it as part of a system, and it's going to interact with manual, and it's going to interact with IPS. In other words, right now, I guess we could just discontinue our involvement with Emma Donnan. But right now, it's really our responsibility to know what's going to go in there, I think.
Well, I think that's important to know, that we make sure we're clear with what we're talking about the school as separate from talking about the building. Because, I mean, it could easily be the situation that that building, I don't know anything about it, is in better shape than some other building they're using for another school, that they just may want to relocate another school into that building. That has nothing to do with us, the way I see it.
I thought I recalled a memo from some point that stated that we could not merge one failing school with another failing school. How is this a different scenario than that, and is that accurate?
Yes, it is accurate. You cannot merge one failing school with another failing school. This would be, as I understand it, this would be something that's not a turnaround academy that would go into the building in which a turnaround academy is contained and then feed the turnaround academy. So think of the turnaround academy as the students, not necessarily the infrastructure within which they're housed, but the students, the affected students themselves, they constitute the school. And that's what the focus of the turnaround statute is aimed at, is the students.
So it's not merging the two separate schools, but rather the facility.
Yes.
So we would still oversee Emma Donnan as a separate separate entity, that it would be housed within Manual?
That's what I understand the plan to
Okay.
be, and that's where the state board's authority to do
Is
that, I
it-
think, becomes questionable.
Do you, I'm assuming, and this might be clear, there'll probably be some clarification on some of this in legislation in the next, because we've learned a lot since we started.
Well,
down this
that's the
path.
conversation we need to have at the end of
Right.
this meeting, is what would you recommend to the full board, based on everything you've learned throughout this process and heard today? And I might suggest it might be easier to think about all this in totality when we talk about Arlington as well. So maybe we could move on to the next
Thank you.
presentation.
This is, I think, related, and it goes to, I think, Charter Schools USA concern about the viability of maintaining a 7-8 school. And I think this was if we can expand that to a K-8 school, their request was to put a charter school in the facility. And again, I think this gets to a legal authority. The state, this body does not grant charters, and furthermore, Charter Schools USA has not been hired by a nonprofit charter board that's authorized to operate a charter school. So our recommendation here in consulting with staff is that this is really outside of your discretion. You're not in a position to make a decision about creating a K-6 charter in the building. The other, of course, very important decision point here, and we've heard, I think, from several members of the Arlington community, is that Ed Power Tinley has indicated they're going to withdraw from the school at the end of the school year, and it creates an immediate decision about how do we best support students in that school. Our recommendation is to, one, to really work with IPS to create and put in place a transformation zone model and have Arlington be a part of that zone. Have IPS assume direct management of the school, so essentially returning the school to IPS, which involves obviously a lot of transition and some challenges that have to be managed because we're talking about the employment status of everyone in that building would be changing if they're retained. So there's just a lot of work that has to be done to ensure a smooth and transition process for students and for the community. We think the mayor's office could potentially play a role, is given their experience doing charter closures and such, and also the relationship with the school as an oversight entity currently. So we feel like there's a mechanism there for the state board to have some oversight of a smooth process. But again, we feel like there's not really a viable TSO operator that we think could fill the shoes of Tinley and Ed Power. We think giving IPS the opportunity to leverage some of the new developments, some of the new board leadership, new superintendent leadership, you would essentially kind of get to the other lead partner schools, but Arlington, along with the other Broad Ripple, Washington, Marshall, could be part of this transformation zone. And again, this really falls in line with recommendations we had about the transformation zone overall, is that there would be an MOU with the state and IPS that really defines what the expectations are, performance expectations, but also the operating expectations. What are the autonomies these schools have? How are they supported? And that you would extend the intervention status through June 2018. So again, when you are looking to make decisions or continuing monitoring how things are going, you're on the same timeline as your TSO schools, but you have up to 3 more years of performance data before you'd have to make decisions about interventions.
Again, that same principle. That doesn't end it. It says if we're doing well, we'll want to ride the horse and stay with it. My biggest question is that last bullet. If, or is it, does the board demand that they have an external partner, or just let them decide whether they want one, or make sure that's clear to this panel?
I don't know if that last bullet is entirely clear. So I think we again would say that the transformation zone is not necessarily is it an absolute necessity that there's a partner organization involved? And I don't think it is, although I think there's certainly something to be said if you're looking at the extent to which you have faith and confidence that this will result in dramatic improvements for these schools. I think there is something to be said for having external expertise come in and support the work. And then, and also just remember, there are two different options we talked about. One is an external partner that's really advising on the setup of the transformation zone, a la Evansville, Vanderburg. But there is also the potential, and given some of the, I think, authorities under HB 1321, where the IPS could actually consider an external partner, even managing these schools under the school corporation governance structure that could give additional autonomy and authority to how those schools are run.
So just a couple things. You had previously asked John to give an opinion about 1321, which Dr. Farabee had presented October 9th to this committee. That was one of the three options. And the conclusion is that that is not currently a lever under the turnaround statute. So again, this goes to potential changes that this committee might recommend to the full board about how to give maximum flexibility to districts, the state board, and any transformation partners or special management companies. The other thing to keep in mind here too is that part of this decision making was triggered by Ed Power signaling it wants to leave the school. So that's forced the board's hand. Charter Schools USA filed a petition for relief, and I think when we hear from them, part of the conversation might be if some changes can be made in terms of funding and statutory authority, would they might want to consider withdrawing their petition and waiting. So I think that's a conversation that you, the committee members, need to have when you invite them up to the podium too.
We talked, this last bullet, I appreciate all that. We talked about ratcheting up the level of the board's direct involvement. And one model says, IPS, go run it. IPS, go get a partner you like. IPS, we're going to give you a partner, and in collaboration with them, you're going to run the schools. That bullet's not clear in terms of where we're at. If do we think, what's the recommendation? I guess as you look around the country, when a school gets in the situation we had there in the last 6 years, how should this be structured in your professional opinion, looking at the experience around the country? I want to maximize the potential of success.
I think there are two things you might be looking at here. One is what is the, if we really talk about a successful transformation zone that is supporting a collection, a cluster of schools. I think there's no doubt in my mind that that is not something that a school corporation has typically done, and that the expertise of another organization can be very beneficial to that process. So I would say I would recommend some level of partnership with an external organization. So yes. On the question of, are there advantages to having an external organization within a transformation zone actually managing the schools? I think that gets into what are the, and some of this gets into the legislative issue of, are there additional authorities, autonomies that are granted to a school or a school corporation as a result of that partnership?
Yeah, but let's say that you can go either way. What's your experience? What's the research tell us?
I mean, my most direct experience is examples where you have, working in Philadelphia, where the district actively took options to have charter operators take over schools. And they had extremely, so many high-performing charter organizations have been very successful. But it was the district who initiated the change that allowed and put conditions in place for those operators to run the schools.
And the district's highly incentivized, because 2018, they have to show some progress or greater intervention will be taken here. So we're putting the clarity and the benchmarks and how we're going to make progress. And then you kind of pick your solution and we work together to try to get there.
Yes, and the other thing to keep in mind, and this goes to one of the high-level recommendations about building the talent bench, is that it's not as if there are hundreds of organizations around the country that have the capacity and expertise and the willingness to do this work. And even with Mass Insight, they carefully select a district because they want to have a willing partnership, not a shotgun marriage. They want to have a great marriage. And so that's also a critical component of success to this kind of an approach.
And I think really adding on to this, and I think that's the last for the IPS discussion, is is the three schools that have had lead partners to date, Broad Ripple, Marshall, and Washington. And they do require some kind of intervention plan because external partners have withdrawn. There is a plan for this year to have Marzano support, but there's not a long-term plan in place. Our recommendation here is to make this part of the transformation zone model for support. And again, IPS will continue to have direct management of the schools. That's not a change. But really what's going on here is what we describe in the transformation model. It's putting it into place and it's saying this is the intervention we think is best able to support these schools.
And so because it's under IPS Commissioner Superintendent's authority, if they wanted to consolidate some of these schools, that's their decision to consolidate it. We would look at the plan.
And to Tony's comments at the start of the meeting, it's critically important to take a holistic view of the capacity of the district. And so that means the extent to which facilities are in good shape or need a lot of capital improvements or costly to maintain, and then the number of seats that are demanded by families in the district. So what is the extent to which the buildings are utilized, underutilized, or vacant? And just thinking about a school in isolation and a facility in isolation without thinking about the overall district just doesn't make economic sense. So as part of this transformation zone plan, there would have to be a master facilities plan that was submitted to the board that says, here's our plan for every school and every facility in the district as part of the ones that we really need to target to help them improve performance.
So they'd line out the economic structure, governance, finance. They're going to build capacity based on that. We'll be talking, we're holding hands here, we're in progress together.
And that's a summary we have now. Beyond this is some decisions about Evansville and in Gary, but these are the scope of recommendations we think address some of the immediate decisions you have before.
So we'd suggest that we pause here and invite either Dr. Farabee or Mr. Hage to come up and address the committee.
Dr. Farabee, would you mind speaking at this point, and then we could have Charter USA? Well, Dr. Farabee, I've had a request from my colleague to have Charter USA speak first, so you could react to it. Or would you rather, we could flip a coin too. We could do like before a foot. Okay, well, he's taller, okay.
He's taller than
We can flip a coin. Now we're at a stalemate. Go ahead. You.
I'll take meeting John requested is we seriously sit down and have an opportunity to talk. I want to begin first by thanking you for your leadership and really digging into the complexities of the turnaround efforts in our state, particularly in Indianapolis Public Schools and other school corporations. This is critical work to the quality of life in our community and the state. So thank you again for the efforts here, also public impact role in providing the recommendations. We are very pleased with the direction of the recommendations from public impact. We believe that the transformational zone model will be one that will be beneficial for the district. We also believe the opportunity in this effort will give us the conversation, the collaboration, the spirit of partnership needed to truly transform student outcomes. We believe that the opportunity to be at the table and actively engage in identifying a partner, having a collective turnaround effort between the schools in the district versus focusing on various partners that would be intervening, we believe it would be, again, a beneficial approach. What we would ask that the State Board of Education would consider as decisions are made is that I know there is a lot of discussion around schools that have made progress, but you still want to see more progress made and more time is needed. We just ask that those same considerations be in play when you think of IPS and corporation. While the schools are not where we want them to be, progress has been made, and we would like the benefit of time to ensure that we continue in that direction. Also, as I shared with this committee and the full board, there is a new administration, board of commissioners that are committed to doing this work and want to ensure that this new leadership has the opportunity to do so. The other point would be with Charter USA and the schools that are currently operated under their leadership. Just caution the state board not to intervene in such a way that we are expanding the work of a charter organization by allowing other students to come into the fold that are not a part of the initial intervention. As I mentioned earlier, we do not believe that this is lawful. We also have encouraged conversation with Charter USA of how we can be helpful, how we can partner. I believe that is the best direction that we can move in. Otherwise, we put ourselves at risk in being in the situation that we're in right now with Arlington. There has to be a transition plan to ensure that the schools that are in the community, within the corporation, with a local context, have ability to ensure that those are their neighborhood schools. And without conversation, without an exit plan, without partnership, I just don't know that we'll get there. So hopefully that will be an outcome from the work that we're doing here. But again, we're excited about the direction, appreciate the opportunity to be a part of the conversation. In this restart, I think what was different is IPS was not engaged in the manner that we are now. We would like the opportunity to serve our students and to ensure that the outcomes significantly improve in the schools they're in question. Again, we made progress, but we know there's a lot more work to be done.
Are there any efforts underway to identify or engage an external partner?
Yes, so we have, in the process of deepening our relationship with KIPP Indianapolis, which is an external partner. We also have innovation fellows that are targeting underutilized facilities or schools that have been consistently low performing. And so we've already started those efforts in that regard. We've also changed how we view facility utilization in the district, and we have more partnerships with facility utilization than we've ever had in the district, from charter schools to private schools. So we continue to look at better ways to utilize in our facilities. I know part of the discussion was how do you utilize all of your facilities, and you want a comprehensive plan. I would just encourage the state board, though, to consider the academic interventions as a separate piece from the facility utilization, which is a completely, totally different issue. And we've had also very favorable conversations with Marzano and a lead partner, and have done research on Mass Insight and the work that's been done in Evansville. We'd like to spend some time with the superintendent and administration there to ensure that we're able to implement as successful and similar model in IPS in the future if the State Board of Education choose to go in this direction.
So if IPS, we follow basically this, you intend to have a lead partner?
Yes.
Some kind of specialized help to work with the turnaround zone schools.
Yes, but we like to, in this model, have the opportunity to select that partner. And as Claire so eloquently described, not have a shotgun marriage, and want to ensure that they are committed and we're committed and we have roles defined. That would be critical to the work to ensure that it's a successful relationship and a long-term relationship. But I think there's a lot that we can learn from what happened in Evansville, and we'll begin that work as soon as we get direction that this will be the plan.
I suspect the board will want to take some of our learnings, provide a template or outline of that would be part of it. we've learned the confusion creates problems. We would take those learnings and ask you to bring back fill in the details. But you would, using the same standards, whether it's IPS, turnaround operators. You need a certain amount of time. Any other questions?
I have a couple. Does IPS need the seats at Arlington and Madonna?
Well, Arlington is an interesting situation where we currently have a student population that poses major operational costs with the district. And so we will have to find ways to repopulate and ensure that students that are currently in that neighborhood not attending that school have an opportunity to come back to their neighborhood school. But we would have challenges operating a facility that can accommodate up to 2,000 students that currently has 300. So we would need a plan for that. What I would encourage the state board to consider as it relates to Madonna and the schools currently operated by Charter USA is that we have more facility space than we have students. And so we like the opportunity to look at perhaps combining some of those sites under the Charter USA umbrella to free up a facility that could be used in a different way. For example, one need that we have in the district is we only have one middle school option at this time for students in middle grades. What we're finding is that the majority of our students are in middle grades within a high school setting, grades 7, 12. In those schools, the high school students are performing at a higher rate than our middle school students, and that is the one area that we're struggling the most in the district, particularly in our middle schools. And we see that when those students are not in the high school environment, they typically perform better. And so we want to have opportunities to ensure that we can offer a true middle school environment. But there are many partners in the area that are interested in partnering with IPS to implement new programs or perhaps new schools. So I think this would present an opportunity to do so.
Does IPS currently have a budget to actually maintain facility in Arlington?
Yes, we can maintain the facility at Arlington. We're doing that now. So part of our agreement with Empower was to maintain the facility. And so we'll continue to do that. We take care of the grounds. We're responsible for the upkeep of the facility. I think what we would continue to do, as I mentioned earlier, is to ensure that we continue to bolster the enrollment in some fashion. We believe that some of the students that are currently in that neighborhood aren't attending the school for various reasons. So we want to ensure that those students have an opportunity to return back to Arlington and we can operate more efficiently than we are right now.
Is there another school in the area for that facility? Share that building with
In our initial recommendation, we had looked at the possibility of John Marshall, which is a school that's close by, but that is not the only option. If we've given time, I think we could plan through, whether or not we have a high school or middle school, or we combine those two together. I think there's several interesting ways that we could create a more robust student population than we have right now. But I think the work begins with identifying what are the students in that neighborhood that aren't currently attending that school. That would be our first priority.
anticipate one external partner for all the transportation services?
I believe a more comprehensive turnaround approach would be the most beneficial. And so IPS, we've had a lead partner at this school and a lead partner at that school and this person and that person. And so it's been very convoluted in terms of really digging into school turnaround. And we believe having one voice, one partner would definitely be more beneficial than what we've been implementing in the past. And it also is an opportunity to continue to enhance the professional learning among the school leaders. And so part of this strategy for this administration is to ensure that those principals that are in those situations are all talking and learning together and learning with each other. And I think it's been challenging that in many cases they've had to answer to or respond to different voices. This is an opportunity to create a learning environment within those schools. I think that's what you're here in public impact work. If you look around the nation, when you can create a network that's focused on intensive support and turnaround, that's typically where you're going to get your greatest gains.
I picked up from the research, Evansville, turnaround zone leaders, turnaround officers, directly superintendent, because these are under directed at other people. You envision that?
Absolutely. I've had an opportunity to be a leader of a zone like that, and I was a direct line to the superintendent and had carte blanche authority to ensure that progress was taking place in those schools. And it was also well understood across the district that these schools are our priority, and if there's a need, we ensure that we remove every barrier to teaching and learning. But to your point, there has to be a very strong partnership between that external organization and IPS to yield the results that we're striving for.
Other questions?
I'll just ask us a question because I'm in favor of current in a back. How long here appropriate?
Yeah, I think that would be the way I understand it. I want to repeat it back to you. There would be a 2-year extension and there would be a 3-year transition period for a total of 5 years. I think that we would need to probably consider shortening that window some. If there's going to be a true transition, I believe that transition work needs to start sooner rather than later. And I believe that the more the district is involved, the sooner that we can make that transition back to the district in a more meaningful way. So perhaps maybe it's, instead of just waiting to year 3 is the way I understand it, the IPS is involved. Maybe earlier, IPS has an opportunity to be engaged with the partner, and then we monitor outcomes. And if outcomes continue to improve, there's opportunities to transition sooner rather than later. I just wouldn't want us to hold ourselves to a 5-year commitment if we can create a partnership that works. Does that make sense?
Let me ask a better question, because what I'm really trying to ask you is what period of time is adequate? So let's just take the contract part out.
Right.
How long would it take, in your estimation, to have an adequate?
Oh, at least 18 months to 2 years, because what we've seen with Ed Power, I mean, we started that work last year, and that's continuing to this school year. So to ensure that there is a clean baton toss where student progress is continuing to take place, I would say 2 years would be a good window.
No further questions? Appreciate you taking time from your busy schedule to be here, Dr. Perry. And I also we noticed it, Gary, Evansville, and here, from when we started this, 4 years ago? The spirit of cooperation and interest and working together is way up. That's partially due to your leadership. So thank you. John?
Committee, Mr. Chair, nice to see you today.
Good to see you.
So there's a lot, obviously, to consider as you go through the entire plan. We had a chance to start reading it last night and this morning, and I would say that in detail, that there's a lot of good here. The staff has done a lot of good work. There's been a lot of thoughtfulness. We appreciate the opportunity to speak before this committee and give feedback onto the transition process, what it's meant, what it's looked like, what are some of the challenges, what are opportunities for improvement. And I think a lot of those are put in here, so I think there's a lot of guidance for legislation to improve the current law, potentially to even add components to that law that might make it more specialized and more successful. We're happy to play a role in that. We do that around the country in many ways and forms, in advising and supporting ideas on the ground that have made sense. One of the things that does come to mind during this process is that it's really important, having done turnaround work around the country, that the state of Indiana send a message that outside operators, because actually one of the bullets was the idea of increasing the number of high-quality turnaround or lead partner operators. So I wanted to speak to that first and foremost. I think as an operator, our perspective on that has been that, yes, it's been chaotic. There's been a lot of political changes. We've had at least 3 bosses to date, so to speak, each doing their role and doing it as best they can. And quite frankly, it's worked in some ways better than imagined, given those changes just in 3 years, having 3 different bosses. But it's also indicative that we're honest with you about the fact that there's been a messaging here during this process too that's important. And that messaging has to be around what's working for students, not necessarily what's working for the underlying systems. So I can appreciate Dr. Farabee's points, for example, around not wanting to allow expansion of grades, for example. During his conversations in the past with both the committee and ours with you at the committee, I think there's been consensus on everybody's part, whether it was legal or not, that the students coming into these turnaround schools were obviously far behind before they showed up the day that they attended the first day of school. And that they were coming from schools that were failing them prior to the actual turnaround statute focusing on these schools. And without being the lawyer here, and I don't want to get into the detail whether it is or isn't lawful for the state board or this committee to recommend today expanding the grades, what I do want to make a case for is that I think both the district, ourselves, and anybody in this position of doing turnaround work would make a consistent case based on the evidence on the ground that to not intervene earlier would be a mistake for the turnaround effort itself, and that to extend contracts without expanding those kinds of influences doesn't necessarily gain the kind of ground that we need to see. Doesn't mean there won't be increased performance. I think you've seen that in Manual. Donnan and Howe are showing very good evidence this year that you'll see into your exams also making those kinds of leaps, and we'll continue to see that performance ahead of the current contract requirements as they're put in there today. That said, it would be so much stronger. The acceleration of that growth would be so much better if we were able to reach younger students, especially siblings, students coming from failing schools, students that would naturally be in the feeder pattern to come to either Howe or to Donnan. And so I think it is very important that we not lose that initiative. And if it isn't deemed to be legally capable for the board to, in fact, implement that reform today, we would strongly recommend, based on the evidence academically that everybody has said, there's no one from the outside or inside who's disagreed with this, that the legislature look at that option, consider that, and quite frankly, this committee recommend that because it's good for kids. At the end of the day, the student wins when that happens. One thing I also agree with Dr. Farabee is that there should be consistent standards. I think that putting everybody in a position of competing for quality for students is good for those kids, it's great for the students, and it's ultimately good for the operators. And I think it's something that we've, from the beginning, felt strongly about, that being in the position of having this opportunity to work for the state, coming in, investing, spending the kind of resources, hiring hundreds and hundreds of employees, and really making this a major mission of our organization has been really something for us that's become a lifeblood issue for us. It's a focus point for us that it's hard to explain rather than just to show you when you come to the schools, which is, it is something we think is a norm, or it's ultimately something that the rest of the country will look at and learn from. And so when I think about this reform and what you've gone through here, the most important thing I hope is considered is that whether the extension is 2 years, 1 year, or 5 years, that's really not been our goal. The whole goal along was to have a situation whereby no matter what the term of the agreement was, as there is progress reports done, as there's accountability, that we have a chance to continually have a part of that success, and that there's an incentive, that there's an opportunity to see these schools long-term in some form or fashion continue to be operated as successful schools. I think, unfortunately, and Dr. Fairby is a reform leader. I know that. I've watched his career, and he and I have talked several times. But superintendents come and go. Changes in boards happen. Districts go through challenges. And one of the things that's important under turnaround, and this is evidenced across the country, and I think Public Impact would tell you this as well, is that to not predetermine outcomes, but to leave in place what's working best for students. And that's the most important part. And if we're not working best, then that should be replaced as well. But if we are working best and we're earning that opportunity to serve students and they're doing a great job and they're academically achieving in ways they would never have done before, I think having an automatic, putting that back into another system is a chance and a mistake, I believe. And I think that the opportunity to consider things such as a charter, which would meet the local board requirements, and have those kinds of options in place and to earn that opportunity is something that it sends a message to the teachers, it sends a message to the parents, and it sends a message to the students that we're not here just for a period of time. We're here to build a lasting, long-term, successful enterprise and make these schools the gem of the community that they once were. So, again, those are the feedback points I'd have for you, and I do want to take up Dr. Fairby on his offer to continue to collaborate and work together. I think there's a lot of ways to do that, and we appreciate his willingness to do that as well.
I think that you bring up a good point. And obviously, every decision we make, I want to be centered on kids. And my utmost priority is to create a situation where these schools are housed within the district and maintained by the district with the local control. But I think going to Public Impact's and Mr. Field's presentation as well, and the fact that we want to expand our bench and have the top-notch players at the table, I think we have to be very careful in any recommendation that we make that we are making this a desirable situation for operators to come into Indiana and help us with these efforts. I think that if we're not careful, we make it not a desirable process where obviously you're here for the kids and you're here to create a better learning situation. I think that we have to be very careful that we are protecting those efforts and that we're making a desirable effort in the first place to attract the right people to come in to do this very
Right, and I think the response that I would have, and I appreciate that, is that set the bar high for folks on the outside if they're going to come in, and whether they work in one form or another in partnering or leading change, but also if the bar is high and the performance is high, make sure that folks have an opportunity to see that transitions into something long-term and it's not an unknown. If you put that as an unknown or even as a negative, then it really demoralizes the process and the team and the people who've invested all their time, energy, and effort in this, and that's hundreds of teachers, et cetera, that go with that. And I think it's just really, really important to send that message that, yes, high standards, high results, but at the end of the day, that means success doesn't necessarily get taken away. There's an incentive. There's a long-term goal there, and that gives everybody a hope, an opportunity to see that. And also, when you academically focus all these decisions on students, I would hope that we wouldn't use legal barriers as ways to focus on what works. So even things that don't today reside necessarily within the venue of the current law that the State Board effectuates, it does allow for you to opine on those things and give feedback so that there could be fixing and tweaking of that so that there is in fact continued growth in the turnaround effort, ultimately having the ability to ultimately hopefully not have to have turnarounds and have successful schools for everyone.
By the way, this is illuminated. Our role here at the State Board is not to perpetuate systems or governance or structures. It's to make sure that those are the servants of students and communities. And I was talking about this earlier a little bit, and I think we're on the same page. I think it will find our board that way. If we find a situation where students are being served well through the teaching processes and systems and engagement of community, then we'll want to stick with that. The contract is really a function of setting out clear performance standard and have them be the same for everybody.
Yes, sir.
And then we'll want to stay in arrangements that are working. And there's some question about community engagement. And in the minutes and in one of the presentations, you talked about that. Do you feel like you're successful in that regard, John, here and around the country, and how do you go about it?
We're making tremendous progress, and I believe today where we are versus where we were is much better. We have about 50 different partners in one form or another around these schools, directly or indirectly. However, I will say we kind of had to start from scratch, so I think it's a great recommendation to have at the beginning a template with some support that sort of helps establish what that should look like, introducing folks that are not necessarily have the local connections so that that's made quicker. We definitely, it took time, that was lost time to build to where we are today. Obviously, we're continuing to build those community relations. The grassroots effort it takes time. And so that transition year, if you go way back to that transition year, that definitely, if you look at it, could have been done very differently in hindsight, where there was a much more collaborative effort with the district, with the state and ourselves, with a template that would have allowed for going in and establishing those. But then again, it's hard to, it's like quarterbacking 2020 armchair. It's to look back. I mean, this is one of the first efforts like this in the country. It's bold, it's big. I think it's succeeded in many ways, but I think that the success of its future is dependent upon the tweaks that you make now, and those being thoughtfully made with input, hopefully, from the local operators.
Now, I have one, while we have the mic here, one of the things we have learned over and over again, this is it's a school issue, but it's a school within a system, and you've made the taken the position that this is a process K through 12, and that picking students up at 7th grade is not ideal. When we talk to the legislature about how to remedy that, so if you have schools that are chronically failing, 7, 8, 12, as a turnaround operator and an operator of schools, what should the law say? I mean, how would you do that? How do you see it? How would you what situation would you like to operate in?
I think that ultimately what we've seen work around the country is when you empower districts and operators, partnerships, separate together, whatnot, into zones where choice is a part of the process, then it works. So to the degree that there were feeders that had more choice related to them, whether those were charter feeders or a hybrid that allowed for students in failing schools where the parents, for whatever reason, they felt that the student wasn't being met, their needs weren't being met, or perhaps there was a sibling issue and the parents already dropping one child off at the middle school and the high school, or that the feeder itself is failing. So I think there's a couple ways to do that that's narrow and crafted, but at the same time provide some relief academically, which is in fact the goal. And if we're all focused on that academic goal of driving student achievement, then I don't think there should be opposition to that concept as long as we're working against sort of standards that everybody understands are very high. So if the standard's high and you're getting results, you should earn the opportunity to serve more students, especially if those students are already proven to be coming in below grade level. And I think that's really the thesis behind it. And again, educationally, there really hasn't been any, I think, disagreement with that. I think it's become more about maybe perhaps the legal, political implications of that. But I think if you put that secondary and put this in place, then you'll have a situation where achievement is coming up faster. Getting students into Madonna that are 2, 3, and 4 years below grade level is just not a sustainable model. We've talked about that in the past. I know Dr. Farabee would agree with the same thing if he was running Donnan today, and he would be looking at similar models, and I know that. So I think all we're saying is we want to have the same freedom to be able to effectuate those students at an earlier grade, but only if we were proving results for those students year over year.
You're willing to earn it.
Yes, sir.
Any other questions? Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Claire?
I am mindful that we only have 25 minutes left, and we have lots of decisions we still need from you. So I would ask the chair to direct us, should we continue the recommendations for Evansville and then Gary, and then have you make a vote and decision, or do you want to talk about IPS now? And then we've talked with Tim about how do we speed through the rest, because we continue to need some guidance from you.
Let's go with rest recommendation.
Just a few things I want to point out, just based on the comments from Dr. Farabee and from Mr. Hage about their comments. One is that totally agree with the notion of having to intervene earlier. And one thing I don't think we highlighted that is in the recommendations is that for transformation zone, we don't think it should be limited necessarily to just those turnaround academies. To the extent that there is a compelling reason to also provide, the same level, have elementary school feeders in the transformation zone makes complete sense. So we agree with that notion. Second, I want to be mindful that this idea of transition timeline. We aren't suggesting that there's this 3 years path towards, if there's success, to go back to the school corporation. Our recommendation is if you have success, replicate it, keep it, sustain it. So whether that's a charter school or a contract school or a district managed school, what you want is a successful school that's meeting the needs of those students. So I would not recommend a predetermined outcome, regardless of results. And then just last, just be careful that I think Mr. Farabee's idea that they want to control what happens with Emma Donna makes complete sense. We got to be careful that if there is, for instance, consolidation of putting more students in Emmerich Manual, we don't want actions of IPS, I think, hurting those other schools. So they're losing enrollment because another middle school is being formed. So I think it's important to just coordinate those various solutions.
That's kind of why I wanted to see a plan before we took over a group of students, but as part of a system. Somehow, maybe it has to be clear in law, because there's too many square feet for the number of children, and sometimes wonder about when I see charter schools popping up and there's empty buildings. You can't do this in isolation.
We do think, you have the authority right now to order the closure of a school and consolidation. So we do think that you have the authority as part of a state-directed intervention to ask for a comprehensive plan that would inform your decision-making.
So I think these may be more straightforward. So with Glenwood, this is an existing turnaround academy. Our recommendation here is really that the transformation zone model has not been formalized. Right now we have a district, a core corporation working with the partner. Our recommendation is to simply is to formalize that, create an MOU between the state board, the state, and the school corporation to just clarify performance expectations, operating conditions, et cetera. This is partly reflecting the fact that although Glenwood, there's been some good signs of the relationship being helpful, Glenwood is still an F school. Glenwood still has a long way to go. And we have Lincoln, which we'll talk about briefly. There's just a need to have a more formalized process. Lincoln is newly eligible. This is another Evansville school for state intervention. They're already a part of the transformation zone in Evansville. Our recommendation essentially is that you identify the transformation zone as a state intervention. And again, there's an MOU that clarifies operating conditions, performance expectations for those schools.
Let me ask a question. My understanding from the presentation by Mass Insight in Evansville was that they saw their term coming to a close, that they felt like they were completing their work there and that they had given the tools to Evansville that they needed to succeed within the transformation zone. Does this extend with Mass Insight further than what they are currently intending, or does that fit within their current?
Bob, do you want to speak to that?
I would recommend that it extend their term. because they haven't progressed at the level with either Glenwood or Lincoln, who's been a part of that zone, at the level that we need to see them. So I would encourage that it be an extension.
And do we know if Mass Insight is willing? I know that they had made some comments alluding to, we've given you what you need, now we're out. This is not a long-term solution. Have we had conversations with them to know if they would be willing to extend it?
I would anticipate they would, but I think it would involve a conversation with Dr. Smith and
Right. Okay.
Mass Insight.
Bob, before you sit down, can we get a copy of the contract between Mass Insight and
We've requested that, and Dr. Smith is sending it to us.
And move on to Gary. So Roosevelt, I think the decision point we're pointing out here is really that the current contract doesn't have the explicit performance benchmarks that really are necessary to have informed transition decisions. So our recommendation here is to renegotiate the contract, to set clear and explicit benchmarks. I think that's something that I would suggest Edison also is interested in having. To establish an MOU between the state and the Gary School Corporation that really clarifies those roles and responsibilities and ensures that we have smooth operating conditions, or looks to ensure smooth operating conditions. But also benchmarks to assess the district's capacity. So when transition options happen, again, you have both the school success but also the corporation success. The third is that I think based on, I think we are also, suggesting a 2-year contract extension could make sense. I think the caveat there is that with what's happening with Gary, with some of the financial strains that's happening, I think any decision regarding either an extension with Roosevelt or any decisions around Dunbar-Pulaski, which is eligible for state intervention, really be informed by some kind of comprehensive needs assessment of Gary, so that there is, again, a school corporation plan, not just a school plan. And we do think there is the potential, for Edison to play a role with Dunbar-Pulaski. It could be that there is some consolidation that's happening with Roosevelt, but again, these are all things that need to be a part of a school corporation-wide strategy.
Remind me what?
Well, the one thing I'll add on there is the fact that, it's my understanding, February of this year, Indiana Department of Education has been in there doing a comprehensive needs assessment in preparation for their high-risk designation action plan. Dan, is that right? You all do a needs assessment in Gary? Is it completed? Okay, so that's been going on since they sort of gave up their right to spend federal money in February. So I'm not sure there's a real open question what the needs are. I mean, it comes down really to money. They have a lot of other needs, but a lot of which are based upon the need for money. I don't know of anything that would prohibit, at this point, a vote to extend that contract. Does anyone know anything?
I think the only concern is recently, and it was included in your materials, we met with the head of Edison last week, and we were notified of some concerns about operating losses due to lower than expected student enrollment, plus Edison has had to make some investments in the facility that they think is necessary to have a good, safe environment for kids there. So I think they are also interested in finding out, could there be creative ways of, for example, if they were to take on Dunbar-Pulaski, could there be some combination in a facility so there's some economies of scale? And I think, in addition, some of the more recent concerns we just learned about, Gary, the lien by the IRS, the lien by the water company, et cetera, just generally makes for uncertainty around the financial condition of the district, and the ability to continue providing utility services and transportation for students is a significant concern.
So it's the issue that Edison may not want to extend?
They might not be able to afford it. Yeah. I think there's very much a desire to want to continue to work. And in fact, there's a great relationship between Dr. Pruitt and Edison, Mr. Jackson. So.
I think we should be very careful in those discussions to in no way suggest or allude to the fact that Edison can take over Dunbar-Pulaski. I mean, clearly, there's a process by which an external partner around school operating placed at Dunbar, that would need RFP process, be open to other providers. It just couldn't be handled.
I think the other point you make, and I think it's explicit here, is that any decision on Dunbar Pulaski was certainly wanting to involve the community in that decision. That would be a very important part of the steps around
Any other comments? Should we go back to the IPS and give our staff some direction?
Yes, please.
My colleagues, I have a concern. I think you've done great work here, and given what we've learned, we will have to put great effort in getting standards of progress clarified, whether it's a district operational lead partner. So let's make sure that that's the same for everybody. I would look at these contract extensions more like a minimum and then what they have to do to earn the right to have them extended. Because I think if they're good operators, that'd be true if if the state intervenes, the district wants to know, hey, let's work under this model for a couple of years. Our intention is this is going to work and we can move forward together. But I think if you really want people to invest in people and money and time and travel and effort, put their heart and soul in the deal, isn't so adios. Work, the community will like it, and I think we ought to work on that. I don't know quite how to state it. My preference, my colleagues want to do it, is not to limit, but to look for ways it expands around the idea that it's successful. I don't know who does this work, but assessing a district's strength and how they're organized, which then calls the question, let's make sure that the state's organized on the best model of how to lead. We have a strategic plan for all the schools. We have a Department of Education for hundreds of schools. Once you earn your status as need for intervention, children's lives are being brought. Now you're in a different category. I want a direct line of sight to this board, to our turnaround office, to the superintendent, their turnaround office. No confusion, no bureaucracy, nobody coming in from right or left. We know how this is going to go. We know how they're going to be measured. We know what resources. And those resources could be around engagement. So I would also say that once we intervene in a school, if it's going to be repurposed, closed, because it's part of a system, we need to know what's happening with it. Intervene for the students in that school, but it got on our list because it was part of a system that couldn't make it work. I just wouldn't want to say, once we're in a school, I think we need to see a plan from the district. Maybe there's other people that want to see it. We have a great plan for this building. We intervene there, and we can't pretend like it's just a school. Too many square feet for the bodies. And I want to make sure whatever he's putting, what's their capacity to do this under a turnaround, whatever. So I think we ought to be very careful. Just say we're returning buildings that are under intervention.
I don't know if you need us to specifically state it, but I think before we even go into what we would recommend back to the full board on each of these individual schools and district situations, I think we need to strongly reaffirm those 8 recommendations. I don't think any of these work if we don't put those in place consistently. So I don't know if you need it officially, but I feel like that's underlying work of all that we're going to do. And I think that needs to be very strongly stated back from my perspective, at least, as a recommendation back to the board.
So, Sarah, thank you. I agree. In other words, they'd be the guiding principles.
Right.
They'd be for our staff or anybody's involvement. If you want to know the rules in the road, there's the guiding principles.
And that has to be clearly established before we can release that to make sense or be successful.
I kind of went into
Turnaround
some
efforts.
specifics, but those are my main concerns, specifics. I think as far as the rest of the IPS recommendations, we would ask IPS to come back with a plan around these schools that are under intervention. We'd want to know about their lead. I think we ought to assist or staff that template look like, research, best practice, desire by all involved to make that work. We're going to have performance standards. They're going to report back to us. So if we were talking about the school's intervention with IPS, I generally think you're in the right direction. I had a few caveats. That's regard to the IPS recommendations, caveats.
Not wholly as written, right? General principles, like for instance, Arlington, without requirement of this partner. The recommendation is question partner. So I wouldn't recommend.
Except for in the but transformation zone, we want to see the plan. We're expecting there's going to be a partner there, and that the roles, responsibilities are. So the whole board would probably be very hesitant if we didn't see a plan come back.
And, I mean, Dr. Farabee mentioned specific looking at it and potentially moving forward with. Also, kind of what those specific goals would look like, what key ideas would be.
You test it against the
Right.
principles
Right.
and make sure it's clarity there. So the board, the people today, or the situation they're in today, we got here because we had to intervene. Like I don't want to pretend like paper over that. We have responsibility to see the plan. Plan's solid. This basic structure you've outlined could possibly work. We would also want to see a plan. We want, or it's just one way or another. And if that takes a while to put together, it takes a while to put together.
But that's similar to what the expectation was with Evansville also. We can just automatically assign a transformation zone to them. They can be presented exactly what it's going to look like. Here's how it will work on a daily basis. And there was intact there as well. So I think that's the same expectation we should have. I like the idea. I like the direction we're heading towards. But I don't think it's just kind of a blanket vote for it. I think that we still look at how the pieces come together specific. Right.
So if I can summarize what I think I've heard, it's a clear path forward on the contract extension for CSUSA, 2 years as a minimum with this is how you can get additional extension and or get spun out as a charter if that's what the board ultimately decided to do. In terms of the transformation zone plan, which would include Emma Donnan, you'd want to see a detailed plan first from IPS. And because time is of the essence, that would have to be put together pretty soon for you to make an informed decision and give enough time for the start of the next school year.
And they would work with our board staff on that, just for clarity.
Now with Emma Donnan, I think there also needs to be some additional guidance from you. I'm not sure that you can act on the recommendation about having the facility go back and the students go into manual unless you've seen that plan, correct?
But I'm a little confused also because you said the transformation zone including Emma Donnan. However, Emma Donnan, in terms of the actual student population, is still under CSUSA.
Thank you for clarifying. So part of the transformation zone plan has to be a master facilities plan for the district as a whole. So if it's true that the facility must go back to the district, then we need to see the plan for what are you going to do with all your space?
Right.
Which might include closure and other things at the board's direction.
Okay.
And in any event, as you saw in the detailed recommendations, the board has to approve the plan for the transformation zone
That's part of statute.
of any facilities that are excess capacity.
I don't think we have jurisdiction. We have jurisdiction.
Under board intervention, correct. So that would be from them, a plan from them about how they're going to use their space. Because to the point earlier, you don't want to set up a competing structure to undermine the success of a turnaround that the board has voted for and has confidence in.
So do you want to we're having an economic scale issue with manual. So we're trying to improve the possibilities of success, because economics are part of it. So now we have a building sitting empty. Do we want another middle school to come in there? We intervened there, and part of the problem with intervention was you didn't have critical mass, economically speaking. So I think we want to know what's going to happen to that school before we just, it's part of this.
And
I think we want to know it, but we don't have jurisdiction.
Well, there's
If we
two
move
there's
and
two
it's there.
competing requests. There's the one from CSUSA to say they wanted to have a feeder, which our attorney has concluded is not possible under existing law. But they have their economies of scale issue, and so a possible solution is combining with the manual facility, so you have a 712 school. But it sounds like, given what I'm hearing from you, with still some uncertainty, that we probably need to go back and talk to both IPS and CSUSA to ask if, based on this conversation, if they have a revised request for the full board, and then have a recommendation come to the December 3rd meeting.
Concerning M&D.
Yes.
Understanding that they would get the Donnan building back. Yes. So if they want to move the Donnan school into the same building with Manual.
That's one proposal, but I think we need to go back and talk to both CSUSA and IPS just to see, based on the conversation today, whether the request might have been modified. The handwritten note that was just handed to me was whether or not there could be some flexibility for CSUSA on Donnan to move at the speed that made sense relative to any plan that the board approved for the transformation zone for IPS. I still think there needs to be clarity for both parties, so I think we should probably have some conversations in advance of the December meeting.
And I think there should be a lot of latitude for the TSOs and the school corporations to work together to figure a lot of this stuff out. Because maybe IPS could make use of that building right now. So, I mean, if it works out economically for Charter School USA to take the Donnan school number and move that school into the same facility with the manual building and turn the building back at the Donnan building back over to IPS, they should be able to do that. I'm not even sure that requires much from us other than maybe the movement of the school number from the one facility to the other, because the property still remains IPS. They're just getting it back.
I think our friends want, I would like to hear from you, being you seem to be standing. I would appreciate it. I understand that maybe technically, but it's an ecosystem. It's in our notes, ecosystem. Economic juice, critical mass.
In terms of the transformation zone, what is a critical piece of this is we have not talked about resources. And, you know, we believe one of the characteristics that have allowed that model to be successful is the amount of resources associated with that model. And so I know there's a lot of conversation with IPS bring us back this, IPS bring us back plans. And, you know, I think we need to make sure that we at least have a sense of what the resources will look like in implementation. Secondly, you know, one of the things I think would be a misstep for us is to rush to get back a plan that's comprehensive and thorough to you in a week or two on the future of these schools. And so I think part of the work that we may consider is, you know, embedding some transition time into the conversation to ensure that we have well thought out and strategic plans for the utilization of the schools. There'll be many conversations that we'll need to have with partners, and we also want to make sure that there's opportunity to bring the community into the fold of the conversation.
If I may make a point also, I heard Dr. Farabee say before in talking about movement of your buildings that the research does not support middle school grades for the high school setting. I'm not sure what's that based upon, if that's just strictly IPS.
Right, so that's just in studying our data. If you look at the schools that have been struggling, the poorest performing students within that building in the 712 model are the students that are in 7-8. If you look at the students in our district that are in 7-8, that are in either K-8 or 7-8 facilities, their performance far exceed those that are currently associated with the 712 model. It could be a function of the way that we've structured that model. That's something that we're looking at, whether we need to reallocate resources. Do we think we need to move students? You know, those are things that we're discussing. But I wouldn't want to commit today that IPS is going to come back with a well thought out plan of converting down to school. I was just using that as an example.
Right. No, but it's hanging in the back of my mind as we're having a conversation about combining Emmett-Donnan with manual in that same type of setup. I don't know if that's something that board staff would be capable of providing some research or background on, but it's something that I don't want to combine these schools for financial purposes to the detriment of our students' success.
Understood.
So I want to make sure that whatever situation we're putting in place doesn't just help us financially, but that we're not setting CSUSA up for failure.
And John.
And I just want to say that I appreciate that because we appreciate the recommendation and the thought behind it, but it may or may not be the best ultimate plan on the ground. And I think that's the flexibility I think we'd like to have a chance to maybe work behind the scenes on and think that through. Because there's more than just the economics involved here. There's the feeder pattern, there's the student achievement issues, and a lot of other issues that would actually impact this. As well, safety issues, building setup issues, a lot of things. So I'd like to have a chance to look at that as well as other options perhaps with the district on Donnan.
Okay. So in the interest of time, we agree with the principles. The recommendations on IPS are generally correct. We want clarity on the extension. It's a minimum with forward push. We want some plans, hopefully worked out cooperatively, that increase the chance we're going to be successful. We want the template and the outline of the lead partner that's going to work with the transformation zone and timeline clarified. And we want performance standards to be the same for how much runway we give a traditional district vis-a-vis a turnaround zone, vis-a-vis a transformation zone, vis-a-vis a TSO. We want people working off the same standard. In terms of Evansville,
Fully in favor of formalizing the transformation zone.
and Gary, I see a lot of open questions, just the basic economic viability. We have struggles.
Yeah, as I started out today saying, I have sort of two prerequisite questions. You know, do you need the seats? Can you afford the building? I suspect the answer in here for both of those questions would be no. So if for some reason Edison's not able to move forward, I think the option there is closure.
There's an issue of, we've already brought up, it's in the principles, our structure here at the state level. Structure will request of transformations of districts. Dr. Farabee already experienced that. Dr. Farabee was a good example. When we go to the legislature, that kind of brings the legislative agenda. To have a turnaround office, some resources available to it. I don't want to create an incentive to get in trouble and the state's going to bring more resources to get more school struggle. So, but we will need some resource for this. They're critical patients fixed. So that'll have to
So just to clarify, because Dunbar Pulaski is up for board intervention, I hear you about the RFP, but also, as our recommendation stated, we would be hesitant for the board to vote on anything until we had this broader assessment of the district. So we can work with the department to find out where their comprehensive assessment is in the process and see how quickly that can be completed, and then come up with when we might have a reasonable plan to present to the board.
So what is it we're looking for there? Where we ever did a neat assessment of the whole district before we other schools?
Well, as I was mentioning earlier, I think the board has broad authority to ask for that because you can't make a decision in isolation about one school without considering the ecosystem. And especially in the case of Gary, where there has been recent news, even since our last board meeting, about continued financial challenges, there are some serious questions about the sustainability and of some of the economics there.
I'd summarize that very clearly. Well, next time we intervene in schools, I want evaluation done in the district. How did you end up with 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8 schools? I mean, that didn't happen by accident. There's a problem. Very practically, like Gary right now, I mean, if your withholding tax isn't paid and your utilities aren't paid, I mean, we need to know that ecosystem. You can't you can't intervene in a school in that situation responsibly without knowing where we're going to go.
I think that's an important point. It's not just the history. It's what, or whatever.
So going forward, I would, this district evaluation, something we always do, and very practical. We can't do one thing without understanding.
Yeah, and I guess I'm bouncing back and forth between thinking about this under our current statutory framework where they have to provide transportation and thinking about this under what really should be tossing that statute out. But yeah, I mean, under the current requirement that the district would have to support certain things, definitely know that. But I guess then
So we had all of the legislative related recommendations that we need your guidance on. And then Public Impact had its last few slides on the turnaround unit conversation.
well, not quite all the legislative recommendations, because we haven't really determined, and maybe we won't, as to when this state intervention begins. That's an open question in my mind.
Yes, and I'm sorry, I might not have said that clearly. I have some slides that were the summary of the last part of the report after Tim speaks about this. I think this will take some conversation from you about what's your preference for, as Dan's called, the straight line site. So if we can have Tim talk about this.
So we touched on this before, and again, our focus here is we need the capacity, you need an organizational model that really facilitates implementing the responsibilities, but also has the right direct authority to the SBOE. There are two different models we've kind of contemplated and put out there for your consideration, and we've got some summaries, and this is all in the memo, of course. But one is the independent state turnaround unit, and one is the state takeover district. So it's actually an LEA. We have examples of both these across the country. This is just, I'm not going to walk through this, but this is just kind of highlighting kind of the distinctions between the two. And again, the state takeover district, this is an LEA, a different kind of LEA, mind you, but it would be structured as an LEA, similar to what Tennessee and Louisiana has done. Maybe the most important thing to focus on is maybe kind of our thoughts about benefits and challenges to the two models. And when we think about this independent state turnaround unit, one benefit is that it could be directly reporting to the state board. So you have a direct accountability, direct oversight. Because you're creating a new unit, the kind of operational governance policies could be tailored to the specific needs. We also view this as kind of a flexible solution to some extent. It's possible you could create this independent unit, staff it, give it clear responsibilities. Over time, it could become apparent that it needs to be an LEA, or remains as a unit, as its own separate unit. So there's some options there. One of the couple of challenges that arise, one is that the staffing as a state entity would be subject to the provisions and restrictions of how you staff a state organization. So getting the talent, the pay, whatever it is, all those policies, there's some restrictions there. And we've heard states kind of talk about how that's somewhat challenging. And then you can't be a direct charter authorizer. So this unit could not directly authorize charters. You'd have to go through another authorizer in the state.
I'm going to interrupt you. When I read this, and then earlier when we talked about it seemed to me you start there and look if we want to migrate over, but you almost have to do the turnaround unit to start with, and then come to understand how you'd want to expand or contour it to future needs.
I think there's a strong rationale. I think the only major disadvantage really probably is that staffing piece. I think the takeover district, there's some authorities there, but you're going to have a governing board for that LEA. With some complications to that. So I think we would be comfortable. I think there's good rationale for creating this independent state turnaround unit in the short term. If not forever, but I think certainly as the immediate solution.
I'm just a little confused. Is that would be different than just hiring or having this done within SBOE staff?
I think it comes down to how you define the roles and responsibilities of the unit. Could it be the SBOE staff? I think it could be, but I think our point being that you want this to be, I think, if this is a state intervention model, something you intend to continue and sustain over the years, that you'd want to structure it so that it has those roles, responsibilities, the funding for it is clear. I just don't know if you want to be SBOE staff, or if you want to be a separate entity. That would be a decision around.
We can figure that out.
Yeah.
It seems to me you want to structure under set, but the larger point here is, in our recommendation, we need resources for a turnaround. Or when we do intervention and research. Eventually, we're going to create an LEA out of it. Decision making, I suspect, huh? Do you agree with that?
I think it should be part of SBOE.
Yeah. That's kind of my leaning as well. Office with it.
The last piece where we need some guidance from you. This was at the tail end of the report. We took public impacts recommendations as well as other input from stakeholders just to kind of elucidate, if we didn't think it was clearly called out, that might require either buy-in and support from partners outside of State Board of Ed and DOE, as well as potentially some legislation. So under human capital and talent, around the prep programs through teacher colleges, obviously going through the Commission for Higher Education as a starting place, to try to get more engagement from universities around the state to help with that. The other is the State Board of Ed to request some kind of a turnaround talent acquisition and retention fund to be managed through that turnaround unit, to help with, could be some kind of a fellowship program, there could be a grant to an existing organization, et cetera. Obviously, partnering with existing talent development organizations, and then the dedicated turnaround unit that you've just talked about, having it identifying and helping to disseminate best practices around how can you use your existing resources and repurpose your staff so that you're improving instruction. And there is some work and research around that related to turnarounds. So I guess first question, I'll stop there and say, do you support the idea of seeking some kind of funding for talent acquisition? Because that would obviously be a budget request from the board.
I absolutely thought you're right.
Okay. Okay, second thing is you've just talked about having the independent unit as part of State Board of Ed staff. And then the other is, now that there is staff for the State Board of Ed, having the State Board of Ed be the contracting entity so there's a clear line directly to the State Board of Ed. Is that the committee's? Okay. And then if it is just staff of the State Board of Ed, then that would just be through the regular hiring. But one other idea was, right now the special education director for the state is appointed by the governor and reports to the State Board of Ed. So that could be formalized in statute, or it could just be part of hiring within the State Board of Ed staffing. Do you have a preference? Just part of staffing?
I want to be able to act swiftly and well.
Okay. Okay, now facilities. Obviously, this has been a major challenge both for the districts in which there have been interventions as well as the turnaround operators. So a couple of different ideas. We've talked about this already. Whenever the board is intervening in a district, don't just think of a school in isolation, but actually ask for a comprehensive facilities plan. I'll go to the next page here. That ensures that there is some thought to what is the demand for seats, what's the available capacity, and then what is the condition of those buildings. Will they require lots of investment for capital improvements, how much they cost to operate, et cetera. And then that should help inform the discussion about whether the district should make some decisions around closing, repurposing, or renovating facilities. And then it also helps to inform the board's decision when you're taking that action. Do you close it? Do you have it merged with a higher performing school? Or do you actually spin it out with a turnaround operator? And then the second is, and Tony, you've mentioned this before in a couple of different committee meetings, is in addition to asking for funding for talent acquisition, is there some thought to having a dedicated turnaround facilities fund that's a revolving loan fund that would help with some renovations, et cetera, for the turnaround districts? The other option would be to get a pro rata portion of the local property tax dollars whenever there is a TSO operated school, so that they are directly responsible for managing and they have the funding to do so. And all of those two would require legislative change to do that.
I mean, right down the line, I think this is what we've learned.
Okay.
I mean, my recommendation on that is probably even a little broader, because I think that whole statute should be eliminated, where it defines who's responsible for building maintenance, transportation. All of that should be subject of the contract negotiations. So any TSO or external partner.
The statute would give us to
Right.
oversee that.
Yeah, because it's not going to work the same. Case in point, Gary, right? They can't afford to bust their own kids. So that there needs to be some discretion there. So I think actually that whole statute, all that should be subject to negotiation. And then that way it also gives, I would think, gives the TSOs or external partners a better idea of what they're.
Is there agreement from the other committee members on that? Tony's suggestion? Okay. Funding. So we obviously entered down this path of creating a committee because of the fact that we had a finite pot of SIG dollars. We no longer have the ARRA funds that the state first used to fund interventions. And then we have more schools coming online for state intervention. So you have the same amount of money, more schools, more mouths to feed. So one obvious suggestion would be to ask for some dedicated funds that could supplement the SIG dollars. And then the second is we probably need to rethink how are we allocating those federal dollars. So there had been a move earlier this year to try to give a little more support to schools that were earlier on heading down the path so they could try to do some things to avoid intervention. And kind of in retrospect, here we are in the year 3 of these turnarounds, probably should have found a way to get the maximum amount to them so they could actually have some success that would allow the board to make a decision about, is this the right model in the first
To me,
place?
this is another misalignment of governance. I mean, people making decisions. The board says we're going to turn around the school zone. Somebody else says we're going to start. I would like to see state law support the idea. Once you take a strategic move, if you don't have the resources under that governance to pull it off, it's a fantasy. And again, these schools don't need this today, that tomorrow. We need a disciplined, clear sight, clear goals, stay on it. Get them back to where they're healthy so we can move on. And anywhere there's confusion, we play into more problems. Where there's clarity,
I think it's a natural support also to the idea of a partner. We need to make sure ahead to how are we going to help provide that as an earlier.
And then I think the student improvement grant should really be administered by this newly created turnaround unit under SBOE, who would handle not only the grant administration, but the distributions of that money.
yeah, that was a whole bunch of wasted energy. I mean, and the schools must feel, and the turnaround partner must feel that this is a priority. Have it very predictable. This is how we're going to feather out of this. Help you here, in your business.
Okay.
Otherwise, we build an excuse for leaving and doing all sorts of other crazy things.
One thing that we heard, not going to be reliability on that funding. We're not going to find partners. So we're going to have the authority under the SBOE to make sure that stays consistent throughout the term of the contract.
That's consistent with our decision on contract. We're going to give you a minimum this much, but here's how. You make investments, do a great job.
And then this issue that we heard over and over again about a systemic approach to school turnarounds, I think it kind of boils down to how can we ensure maximum flexibility both for districts to try to fix the district themselves, and then if the state has intervened and assigned the school to a turnaround operator, how do we give them maximum flexibility? So these are all the suggestions, and then we came up with some additional ones based on inputs that we've heard. So allowing the TSOs to actually enroll students in a feeder, so creating a K-12 solution would be one. The second is allowing a charter school to be co-located within a turnaround facility. So I'll stop there because those came directly from CSUSA. Is there support for both of those?
I'm against both.
You're against both those?
For it. I don't necessarily like to have to do that, but I want to maximize my chances. We see a system with a whole bunch of high schools basis. There's a process that's leading. I think until we have the ability to deal with the process.
Okay.
I guess I'm just saying, I'm against the automatic right to do that, but I'm in favor of state board having the discretion as assessing the
Yeah,
overall
you wouldn't
situation of
jump
the
into
district.
that, but you'd have the ultimate authority if you
Yeah,
had
to grant it, but not them having some type of statutory, gives them a right to do it.
There might be a way, because I think we wanted to scale up intervention, not go in firecracker. There's a way you move into the appropriate.
I think the board should have the discretion to go in and look at the whole ecosystem, but without necessarily empowering TSOs.
From the get-go. Okay. The other is IPS had asked for the ability to use 1321, which right now just applies to IPS. And so one thought would be, and our conclusion was that that's outside of the turnaround statute. So the first recommendation would be to allow that to be a turnaround tool under the turnaround statute, so the board would be overseeing that. And then the second is, if that's a good solution for IPS, why not extend that to other districts so that they can employ that solution as well? Again, under the premise of maximum flexibility.
I don't think there's any doubt. Present system had structured contracts, create chronically failing schools, and we need to give them a whole new template to work off of.
Now, that solution requires a charter operator that the district wants to work with. That is a high-performing charter school, because obviously that's what you want to help with the district's performance. So a follow-up suggestion would be to give districts that create a transformation zone maximum flexibility within those transformation zone areas, so they can be flexible with staffing and scheduling the length of the day, et cetera, so they can actually drive results as quickly as possible for the students that have been underserved for years in those schools.
In other words, they could dissolve contracts and arrangements and run it the way they want.
Just like the special management company can right now in the turnaround statute.
They don't have to go there immediately, but if they need that ability, they need to give it. But in a transformation zone, we give them the ability to say, hey, these contracts and arrangements are not working. We want honest.
Okay. And then the last recommendation that Public Impact had made under making sure you have maximum ability to implement Public Law 221 is, as a last resort, give the State Board of Ed the option to have a district-wide solution. So that one's obviously would be a considerable decision to make, and as Public Impact rightly pointed out, you don't enter that lightly. You'd have to be very thoughtful about it and have a plan and make sure there was the capacity in place to execute that. So what are the committee's thoughts on that?
You know, we don't get into these situations because we want. Once you're in them, we need to take care of the situation. I think we ought to go to the legislature.
Okay. And then, Tony, you brought this up. So again, if to address a systemic issue, you need to start earlier. So right now, the board can act after a school has been an F for 6 years in a row. So that by the time you are able to act, it's the 7th year. By the time you've identified a partner, it's either the 8th or the 9th year, depending on the transition year. So a couple of different thoughts. Either extending that to both a D and an F, which would give you some flexibility, and that wouldn't be a must, it would be an option for the board. That would also allow you to target those schools that are FFFD, so that the clock doesn't start again. And then the second would be moving up the timeline, for example, to 4 years. I think, Sarah, you mentioned that earlier. Mm-hmm. So those two thoughts, would like to get your feedback on that.
I still am heavily in favor of 2-year intervention. I think that at year 4, we need to start having those conversations. I like the idea of looking at a partner at that level. I think we wait too long as a whole, and I would strongly support a 2-tier model.
Yeah, and like I was saying earlier, I believe in a 2-tier model also, one that maybe just provides support during the first, second, third, and fourth years of a school or district not meeting the standards. But for me, after a school has been, falls within the category of a focus or priorities for consecutive years, I think there should be state intervention.
Okay.
I think we have more flexibility to play with this also looking at the transformation zone type model. I like that for the first time there's transparency earlier on, that schools can be identified in these earlier stages. And I think, speaking for myself as a board member, I'm more willing to give some flexibility to what those year 6 decisions might look like if I see that there are real and active changes taking place earlier on. We all know that change takes time to see actual results. I think if we're able to see every effort going forth to make those decisions, which I think what we're talking about today puts in place, it gives me more faith in what those year 6 decisions might look like.
And earlier, it might just, the front page of the paper and the radio stations saying, you know, we've been a priority school for now. If we don't get this turned around, the state's going to intervene. I would think that'd be a clarion call to the community. We better get over there, parents. Teachers take a new look, everybody. We've seen the incentive that we will act. As I say, we have this law, we're not gonna let kids languish situation. So I think there's a lot of benefit to getting in earlier, two-tier approach, get people's attention.
And it's not the hard intervention that we're doing now necessarily, because I think that should go on the shelf somewhere. Dustin. So, I mean, when I'm thinking about a 4-year intervention, essentially I'm thinking about a partner.
Mm-hmm.
So, to the extent that that becomes more of the rule.
We don't want them.
Type 2.
We don't want to rush.
Yeah.
The bottom two, we believe we already have authority, just again, on the flexibility around working with the MOU with the district if there is a TSO to make sure that there is access to information about students and some of the feeder system issues that we've talked about. And then the final point in this, the mayor's office, having done the oversight for the turnarounds for the past couple of years, brought this up. Whoever's doing the oversight needs to have the access to the data so that they can make good, timely decisions and spot issues before they become crises, including the board. So that was it for the recommendations that would require, that's it, just more money and
How soon
some
can
other
you get
things,
these
so.
back to us?
Our goal is to have this for you for the December 3rd board meeting, because that was the timeline that we had set forth. Public Impact's planning to come and present. Actually, Brian Hassel, who's the co-leader of Public Impact, is planning to come. And then we can work offline with Dr. Farabee and Mr. Hage on the Emma Donnan, and also come up with a recommended timeline for when it would be reasonable to have a comprehensive plan from IPS.
We're past time, 30 minutes. Everybody had said their piece. I want to appreciate staff, thank you,
Thank you.
presenters, colleagues. I would say aye. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
That's
I'm ready.
productive.
Peace.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm ready.
All right.